The End of Eternity by Isaac Asimov. Narrated by Paul Bamer.
Chapter 1. Technician. Andrew Harlan stepped into the kettle. Its sides were perfectly round, and it fit snugly inside a vertical shaft composed of widely spaced rods that shimmered into an unseeable haze 6 feet above Harlan's head. Harlan set the controls and moved the smoothly working starting lever. The kettle did not move. Harlan did not expect it to. He expected no movement, neither up nor down, left nor right, forth nor back. Yet the spaces between the rods had melted into a gray blankness which was solid to the touch, though nonetheless immaterial for all that. And there was the little stir in his stomach, the faint, psychosomatic touch of dizziness that told him that all the kettle contained, including himself, was rushing upwen through eternity. He had boarded the kettle in the 575th century, the base of operations assigned him 2 years earlier. At the time, the 575th had been the farthest upwen he had ever traveled. Now, he was moving upwen to the 2456th century. Under ordinary circumstances, he might have felt a little lost at the prospect. His native century was in the far downwen, the 95th century to be exact. The 95th was a century stiffly restrictive of atomic power, faintly rustic, fond of natural wood as a structural material, exporters of certain types of distilled potables to nearly every wen, and importers of clover seed. Although Harlan had not been in the 95th since he entered special training and became a cub at the age of 15, there was always that feeling of loss when one moved outwen from home. At the 2456th, he would be nearly 240 millennia from his birth wen, and that is a sizable distance, even for a hardened eternal. Under ordinary circumstances, all this would be so. But right now, Harlan was in poor mood to think of anything but the fact that his documents were heavy in his pocket and tense, a little confused. It was his hands acting by themselves that brought the kettle to the proper halt at the proper century. Strange that a technician should feel tense or nervous about anything. What was it that Educator Yarrow had once said? "Above all, a technician must be dispassionate. The reality change he initiates may affect the lives of as many as 50 billion people. 1 million or more of these may be so drastically affected as to be considered new individuals. Under these conditions, an emotional makeup is a distinct handicap." Harlan put the memory of his teacher's dry voice out of his mind with an almost savage shake of his head. In those days, he had never imagined that he himself would have the peculiar talent for that very position. But emotion had come upon him after all. Not for 50 billion people. What in time did he care for 50 billion people? There was just one person. He became aware that the kettle was stationary, and with the merest pause to pull his thoughts together, put himself into the cold, impersonal frame of mind a technician must have. He stepped out. The kettle he left, of course, was not the same as the one he had boarded, in the sense that it was not composed of the same atoms. He did not worry about that any more than any eternal would. To concern oneself with the mystique of time travel, rather than with the simple fact of it, was the mark of the cub and newcomer to eternity. He paused again at the infinitely thin curtain of non-space and non-time which separated him from eternity in one way and from ordinary time in another. This would be a completely new section of eternity for him. He knew about it in a rough way, of course, having checked upon it in the temporal handbook. Still, there was no substitute for actual appearance, and he steeled himself for the initial shock of adjustment. He adjusted the controls, a simple matter in passing into eternity, and a very complicated one in passing into time, a type of passage which was correspondingly less frequent. He stepped through the curtain and found himself squinting at the brilliance. Automatically, he threw up his hand to shield his eyes. Only one man faced him. At first, Harlan could see him only blurrily. The man said, "I am sociologist Cantor Voy. I imagine you are technician Harlan." Harlan nodded and said, "Father Time, isn't this sort of ornamentation adjustable?" Voy looked about and said tolerantly, "You mean the molecular films?" "I certainly do," said Harlan. The handbook had mentioned them, but had said nothing of such an insane riot of light reflection. Harlan felt his annoyance to be quite reasonable. The 2456th century was matter-oriented, as most centuries were, so he had a right to expect a basic compatibility from the very beginning. It would have none of the utter confusion, for anyone born matter-oriented, of the energy vortices of the 300s or the field dynamics of the 600s. In the 2456th, to the average Eternal's comfort, matter was used for everything from walls to tacks. To be sure, there was matter and matter. A member of an energy-oriented century might not realize that. To him, all matter might seem minor variations on the theme that was gross, heavy, and barbaric. To matter-oriented Harlan, however, there was wood, metal, subdivisions heavy and light, plastic, silicates, concrete, leather, and so on. But matter consisting entirely of mirrors. That was his first impression of the 2456th. Every surface reflected and glinted light. Everywhere was the illusion of complete smoothness, the effect of a molecular film, and in the ever-repeated reflection of himself, of sociologist Voy, of everything he could see, in scraps and holes, in all angles, there was confusion. Garish confusion and nausea. "I'm sorry," said Voy. "It's the custom of the century, and the section assigned to it finds it good practice to adopt the customs where practical. You get used to it after a time." Voy walked rapidly upon the moving feet of another Voy, upside down beneath the floor, who matched him stride for stride. He reached to move a hair contact indicator down a spiral scale to point of origin. The reflections died. Extraneous light faded. Harlan felt his world settle. "If you'll come with me now," said Voy. Harlan followed through empty corridors that, Harlan knew, must moments ago have been a riot of made light and reflection, up a ramp, through an anteroom, into an office. In all the short journey, no human being had been visible. Harlan was so used to that, took it so for granted, that he would have been surprised, almost shocked, if a glimpse of a human figure hurrying away had caught his eyes. No doubt the news had spread that a technician was coming through. Even Voy kept his distance, and when, accidentally, Harlan's hand had brushed Voy's sleeve, Voy shrank away with a visible start. Harlan was faintly surprised at the touch of bitterness he felt at this. He had thought the shell he had grown about his soul was thicker, more efficiently insensitive than that. If he was wrong, if his shell had worn thinner, there could only be one reason for that. Noyes. Sociologist Cantor Voy leaned forward toward the technician in what seemed a friendly enough fashion, but Harlan noted automatically that they were seated on opposite sides of the long axis of a fairly large table. Voy said, "I am pleased to have a technician of your reputation interest himself in our little problem here." "Yes," said Harlan, with the cold impersonality people would expect of him. "It has its points of interest." Was he impersonal enough? Surely his real motives must be apparent, his guilt be spelled out in beads of sweat on his forehead. He removed from an inner pocket the foiled summary of the projected reality change. It was the very copy which had been sent to the All-When Council a month earlier. Through his relationship with senior computer Twistle, the Twistle himself, Harlan had had little trouble in getting his hands on it. Before unrolling the foil, letting it peel off onto the tabletop where it would be held by a soft paramagnetic field. Harlan paused a split moment. The molecular film that covered the table was subdued, but was not zero. The motion of his arm fixed his eye, and for an instant the reflection of his own face seemed to stare somberly up at him from the tabletop. He was 32, but he looked older. He needed no one to tell him that. It might be partly his long face and dark eyebrows over darker eyes that gave him the lowering expression and cold glare associated with the caricature of the technician in the minds of all Eternals. It might be just his own realization that he was a technician. But then he flicked the foil out across the table and turned to the matter at hand. "I am not a sociologist, sir." Voy smiled. "That sounds formidable. When one begins by expressing lack of competence in a given field, it usually implies that a flat opinion in that field will follow almost immediately." "No," said Harlan, "not an opinion. Just a request. I wonder if you won't look over this summary and see if you haven't made a small mistake somewhere here." Voy looked instantly grave. "I hope not," he said. Harlan kept one arm across the back of his chair, the other in his lap. He must let neither hand drum restless fingers. He must not bite his lips. He must not show his feelings in any way. Ever since the whole orientation of his life had so changed itself, he had been watching the summaries of projected reality changes as they passed through the grinding administrative gears of the All-When Council. As senior computer Twistle's personally assigned technician, he could arrange that by a slight bending of professional ethics, particularly with Twistle's attention caught ever more tightly in his own overwhelming project. Harlan's nostrils flared. He knew now a little of the nature of that project. Harlan had had no assurance that he would ever find what he was looking for in a reasonable time. When he had first glanced over projected reality change 2456 to 2781, serial number V5, he was half inclined to believe his reasoning powers were warped by wishing. For a full day, he had checked and rechecked equations and relationships in a rattling uncertainty, mixed with growing excitement and a bitter gratitude that he had been taught at least elementary psychomathematics. Now, Voy went over those same puncture patterns with a half-puzzled, half-worried eye. He said, "It seems to me, I say it seems to me, that this is all perfectly in order." Harlan said, "I refer you particularly to the matter of the courtship characteristics of the society of the current reality of this century. That's sociology, and your responsibility, I believe. It's why I arranged to see you when I arrived, rather than someone else." Voy was now frowning. He was still polite, but with an icy touch now. He said, "The observers assigned to our section are highly competent. I have every certainty that those assigned to this project have given accurate data. Have you evidence to the contrary?" "Not at all, sociologist Voy. I accept their data. It is the development of the data I question. Do you not have an alternate tensor complex at this point, if the courtship data is taken properly into consideration?" Voy stared, and then a look of relief washed over him visibly. "Of course, technician, of course, but it resolves itself into an identity. There is a loop of small dimensions with no tributaries on either side. I hope you'll forgive me for using picturesque language rather than precise mathematical expressions." "I appreciate it," said Harlan dryly. "I am no more a computer than a sociologist." "Very good, then. The alternate tensor complex you refer to, or the forking of the road, as we might say, is non-significant. The forks join up again, and it is a single road. There was not even any need to mention it in our recommendations." "If you say so, sir, I will defer to your better judgment. However, there is still the matter of the MNC. The sociologist winced at the initials, as Harlan knew he would. MNC, minimum necessary change. There the technician was master. A sociologist might consider himself above criticism by lesser beings in anything involving the mathematical analysis of the infinite possible realities in time. But in matters of MNC, the technician stood supreme. Mechanical computing would not do. The largest computerplex ever built, manned by the cleverest and most experienced senior computer ever born, could do no better than to indicate the ranges in which the MNC might be found. It was then the technician, glancing over the data, who decided on an exact point within that range. A good technician was rarely wrong. A top technician was never wrong. Harlan was never wrong. Now, the MNC recommended, said Harlan. He spoke coolly, evenly, pronouncing the standard intertemporal language in precise syllables. By your section involves induction of an accident in space and the immediate death by fairly horrible means of a dozen or more men. Unavoidable, said Voy, shrugging. On the other hand, said Harlan, I suggest that the MNC can be reduced to the mere displacement of a container from one shelf to another. Here. His long finger pointed. His white, well-cared-for index nail made the faintest mark along one set of perforations. Voy considered matters with a painful but silent intensity. Harlan said, Doesn't that alter the situation with regard to your unconsidered fork? Doesn't it take advantage of the fork of lesser probability, changing it to a near certainty? And does that not then lead to virtually the MDR, whispered Voy. To exactly the maximum desired response, said Harlan. Voy looked up, his dark face struggling somewhere between chagrin and anger. Harlan noted absently that there was a space between the man's large upper incisors which gave him a rabbity look quite at odds with the restrained force of his words. Voy said, I suppose I will be hearing from the All-When Council? I don't think so. As far as I know, the All-When Council does not know of this. At least, the projected reality change was passed over to me without comment. He did not explain the word passed, nor did Voy question it. You discovered this error, then? Yes. And you did not report it to the All-When Council? No, I did not. Relief first, then a hardening of countenance. Why not? Very few people could have avoided this error. I felt I could correct it before damage was done. I have done so. Why go any further? Well, thank you, Technician Harlan. You have been a friend. The section's error, which, as you say, was practically unavoidable, would have looked unjustifiably bad in the record. He went on after a moment's pause. Of course, in view of the alterations in personality to be induced by this reality change, the death of a few men as preliminary is of little importance. Harlan thought detachedly. He doesn't sound really grateful. He probably resents it. If he stops to think, he'll resent it even more, this being saved a downstroke in rating by a technician. If I were a sociologist, he would shake my hand, but he won't shake the hand of a technician. He defends condemning a dozen people to asphyxiation, but he won't touch a technician. And because waiting to let resentment grow would be fatal, Harlan said, without waiting, I hope your gratitude will extend to having your section perform a slight chore for me. A chore? A matter of life plotting. I have the data necessary here with me. I have also the data for a suggested reality change in the 482nd. I want to know the effect of the change on the probability pattern of a certain individual. I am not quite sure, said the sociologist slowly, that I understand you. Surely you have the facilities for doing this in your own section? I have. Nevertheless, what I am engaged in is a personal research, which I don't wish to appear in the records just yet. It would be difficult to have this carried out in my own section without— He gestured an uncertain conclusion to the unfinished sentence. Voy said, Then you want this done not through official channels. I want it done confidentially. I want a confidential answer. Well now, that's very irregular. I can't agree to it. Harlan frowned. No more irregular than my failure to report your error to the All-Wen Council. You raised no objection to that. If we're going to be strictly regular in one case, we must be as strict and as regular in the other. You follow me, I think? The look on Voy's face was proof positive of that. He held out his hand. May I see the documents? Harlan relaxed a bit. The main hurdle had been passed. He watched eagerly as the sociologist's head bent over the foils he had brought. Only once did the sociologist speak. By time, this is a small reality change. Harlan seized his opportunity and improvised. It is. Too small, I think. It's what the argument is about. It's below critical difference, and I've picked an individual as a test case. Naturally, it would be undiplomatic to use our own section's facilities until I was certain of being right. Voy was unresponsive, and Harlan stopped. No use running this past the point of safety. Voy stood up. I'll pass this along to one of my life plotters. We'll keep this private. You understand, though, that this is not to be taken as establishing a precedent? Of course not. And if you don't mind, I'd like to watch the reality change take place. I trust you will honor us by conducting the MNC personally? Harlan nodded. I will take full responsibility. Two of the screens in the viewing chamber were in operation when they entered. The engineers had focused them already to the exact coordinates, in space and time, and then had left. Harlan and Voy were alone in the glittering room. The molecular film arrangement was perceptible, and even a bit more than perceptible, but Harlan was looking at the screens. Both views were motionless. They might have been scenes of the dead, since they pictured mathematical instants of time. One view was in sharp, natural color, the engine room of what Harlan knew to be an experimental spaceship. A door was closing, and a glistening shoe of a red, semi-transparent material was just visible through the space that remained. It did not move. Nothing moved. If the picture could have been made sharp enough to picture the dust motes in the air, they would not have moved. Voy said, For 2 hours and 36 minutes after the viewed instant, that engine room will remain empty. In the current reality, that is. I know, murmured Harlan. He was putting on his gloves, and already his quick eyes were memorizing the position of the critical container on its shelf, measuring the steps to it, estimating the best position into which to transfer it. He cast one quick look at the other screen. If the engine room, being in the range described as present with respect to that section of eternity in which they now stood, was clear and in natural color, the other scene, being some 25 centuries in the future, carried the blue luster all views of the future must. It was a spaceport. A deep blue sky, blue-tinged buildings of naked metal on blue-green ground. A blue cylinder of odd design, bulge-bottomed, stood in the foreground. 2 others like it were in the background. All 3 pointed cleft noses upward, the cleavage biting deeply into the vitals of the ship. Harlan frowned. They're queer ones. Electrogravitic, said Voy. The 2481st is the only century to develop electrogravitic space travel. No propellants, no nucleonics. It's an aesthetically pleasing device. It's a pity we must change away from it, a pity. His eyes fixed themselves on Harlan with distinct disapproval. Harlan's lips compressed. Disapproval, of course. Why not? He was the technician. To be sure, it had been some observer who had brought in the details of drug addiction. It had been some statistician who had demonstrated that recent changes had increased the addiction rate until now it was the highest in all the current reality of man. Some sociologist, probably Voy himself, had interpreted that into the psychiatric profile of a society. Finally, some computer had worked out the reality change necessary to decrease addiction to a safe level and found that, as a side effect, electrogravitic space travel must suffer. 100 men of every rating in eternity had had a hand in this. But then, at the end, A technician such as himself must step in. Following the directions all the others had combined to give him, he must be the one to initiate the actual reality change. And then all the others would stare in haughty accusation at him. Their stares would say, "You, not we, have destroyed this beautiful thing." And for that, they would condemn and avoid him. They would shift their own guilt to his shoulders and scorn him. Harlan said harshly, "Ships aren't what count. We're concerned with those things." The things were people, dwarfed by the spaceship, as Earth and Earth's society is always dwarfed by the physical dimensions of spaceflight. They were little puppets in clusters, these people. Their tiny arms and legs were in raised, artificial-looking positions, caught in the frozen instant of time. Voy shrugged. Harlan was adjusting the small field generator about his left wrist. "Let's get this job done." "1 minute. I want to get in touch with the life plotter and find out how long his job for you will take. I want to get that job done too." His hands worked cleverly at a little movable contact, and his ear listened astutely to the pattern of clicks that came back. Another characteristic of this section of eternity, thought Harlan. Sound codes in clicks. Clever, but affected, like the molecular films. "He says it won't take more than 3 hours, said Voy at length. "Also, by the way, he admires the name of the person involved. Noyes Lambent. It is a female, isn't it?" There was a dryness in Harlan's throat. "Yes." Voy's lips curled into a slow smile. "Sounds interesting. I'd like to meet her, sight unseen. Haven't had any women in this section for months." Harlan didn't trust himself to answer. He stared a moment at the sociologist and turned abruptly. If there was a flaw in eternity, it involved women. He had known the flaw for what it was from almost his first entrance into eternity, but he felt it personally only that day he had first met Noyes. From that moment, it had been an easy path to this one, in which he stood false to his oath as an eternal and to everything in which he had believed. For what? For Noyes. And he was not ashamed. It was that which really rocked him. He was not ashamed. He felt no guilt for the crescendo of crimes he had committed, to which this latest edition of the unethical use of confidential life-plotting could rank only as a peccadillo. He would do worse than his worst if he had to. For the first time the specific and express thought came to him, and though he pushed it away in horror, he knew that, having once come, it would return. The thought was simply this, that he would ruin eternity if he had to. The worst of it was that he knew he had the power to do it. Chapter 2. Observer. Harlan stood at the gateway to time and thought of himself in new ways. It had been very simple once. There were such things as ideals, or at least catchwords to live by and for. Every stage of an eternal's life had a reason. How did basic principles start? The life of an eternal may be divided into 4 parts. It all worked out neatly, yet it had all changed for him, and what was broken could not be made whole again. Yet he had gone faithfully through each of the 4 parts of an eternal's life. First, there was the period of 15 years in which he was not an eternal at all, but only an inhabitant of time. Only a human being out of time, a timer, could become an eternal. No one could be born into the position. At the age of 15, he was chosen by a careful process of elimination and winnowing, the nature of which he had no conception of at the time. He was taken beyond the veil of eternity after a last agonized farewell to his family. Even then, it was made clear to him that whatever else happened, he would never return. The true reason for that he was not to learn till long afterward. Once within eternity, he spent 10 years in school as a cub, and then graduated to enter his 3rd period as observer. It was only after that he became a specialist and a true eternal. The fourth and last part of the Eternal's life: timer, cub, observer, and specialist. He, Harlan, had gone through it all so neatly. He might say successfully. He could remember so clearly the moment that cubhood was done, the moment they became independent members of eternity, the moment when, even though unspecialized, they still rated the legal title of eternal. He could remember it. School done, cubhood over, he was standing with the 5 who completed training with him, hands clasped in the small of his back, legs a trifle apart, eyes front, listening. Educator Yarrow was at a desk talking to them. Harlan could remember Yarrow well, a small, intense man with ruddy hair in disarray, freckled forearms, and a look of loss in his eyes. It wasn't uncommon, this look of loss in the eyes of an Eternal, the loss of home and roots, the unadmitted and unadmittable longing for the one century he could never see. Harlan could not remember Yarrow's exact words, of course, but the substance of it remained sharp. Yarrow said, in substance, "You will be observers now. It isn't a highly regarded position. Specialists look upon it as a boy's job. Maybe you Eternals—" He deliberately paused after that word to give each man a chance to straighten his back and brighten at the glory of it. "Think so too. If so, you are fools who don't deserve to be observers. The computers would have no computing to do, life plotters no lives to plot, sociologists no societies to profile. None of the specialists would have anything to do if it weren't for the observer. I know you've heard this said before, but I want you to be very firm and clear in your mind about it. It will be you youngsters who will go out into time under the most strenuous conditions to bring back facts. Cold, objective facts, uncolored by your own opinions and likings, you understand. Facts, accurate enough to be fed into computing machines. Facts, definite enough to make the social equations stand up. Facts, honest enough to form a basis for reality changes. And remember this too. Your period as observer is not something to get through with as quickly and as unobtrusively as possible. It is as an observer that you will make your mark. Not what you did in school, but what you will do as an observer will determine your specialty and how high you will rise in it. This will be your postgraduate course, Eternals, and failure in it, even small failure, will put you into maintenance no matter how brilliant your potentialities now seem. That is all." He shook hands with each of them, and Harlan, grave, dedicated, proud in his belief that the privileges of being an Eternal contained its greatest privilege in the assumption of responsibility for the happiness of all the human beings who were or ever would be within the reach of eternity, was deep in self-awe. Harlan's first assignments were small and under close direction, but he sharpened his ability on the honing strap of experience in a dozen centuries through a dozen reality changes. In his 5th year as observer, he was given a senior's rating in the field and assigned to the 482nd. For the first time, he would be working unsupervised, and knowledge of that fact robbed him of some of his self-assurance when he first reported to the computer in charge of the section. That was Assistant Computer Hob Finge, whose pursed, suspicious mouth and frowning eyes seemed ludicrous in such a face as his. He had a round button of a nose, 2 larger buttons of cheeks. He needed only a touch of red and a fringe of white hair to be converted into the picture of the primitive myth of St. Nicholas, or Santa Claus, or Kris Kringle. Harlan knew all 3 names. He doubted if one Eternal out of 100,000 had heard of any one of them. Harlan took a secret, shamefaced pride in this sort of arcane knowledge. From his earliest days in school, he had ridden the hobby-horse of primitive history, and Educator Yarrow had encouraged it. Harlan had grown actually fond of those odd, perverted centuries that lay, not only before the beginning of eternity in the 27th, but even before the invention of the temporal field itself in the 24th. He had used old books and periodicals in his studies. He had even traveled far down when to the earliest centuries of eternity, when he could get permission to consult better sources. For over 15 years he had managed to collect a remarkable library of his own, almost all in print on paper. There was a volume by a man called H.G. Wells, another by a man named W. Shakespeare, some tattered histories. Best of all, there was a complete set of bound volumes of a primitive news weekly that took up inordinate space, but that he could not, out of sentiment, bear to reduce to microfilm. Occasionally, he would lose himself in a world where life was life, and death, death, where a man made his decisions irrevocably, where evil could not be prevented, nor good promoted, and the Battle of Waterloo, having been lost, was really lost for good and all. There was even a scrap of poetry he treasured, which stated that a moving finger having once written could never be lured back to unwrite. And then it was difficult, almost a shock, to return his thoughts to eternity, and to a universe where reality was something flexible and evanescent, something men such as himself could hold in the palms of their hands and shake into better shape. The illusion of St. Nicholas shattered when Hob Finch spoke to him in a brisk, matter-of-fact way. "You can start in tomorrow with a routine screening of current reality. I want it good, thorough, and to the point. There will be no slackness permitted. Your first spatio-temporal chart will be ready for you tomorrow morning, got it?" "Yes, computer," said Harlan. He decided as early as that he and assistant computer Hob Finch would not get along, and he regretted it. The next morning, Harlan got his chart in intricately punched patterns as they emerged from the computerplex. He used a pocket decoder to translate them into standard intertemporal in his anxiety to make not even the smallest mistake at the very beginning. Of course, he had reached the stage where he could read the perforations direct. The chart told him where and when in the world of the 482nd century he might go, and where he might not, what he could do, and what he could not, what he must avoid at all costs. His presence must impinge only upon those places and times where it would not endanger reality. The 482nd was not a comfortable century for him. It was not like his own, austere and conformist home when. It was an era without ethics or principles, as he was accustomed to think of such. It was hedonistic, materialistic, more than a little matriarchal. It was the only era, he checked this in the records in the most painstaking way, in which ectogenic birth flourished, and, at its peak, 40% of its women gave eventual birth by merely contributing a fertilized ovum to the ovaria. Marriage was made and unmade by mutual consent, and was not recognized legally as anything more than a personal agreement without binding force. Union for the sake of childbearing was, of course, carefully differentiated from the social functions of marriage, and was arranged on purely eugenic principles. In 100 ways, Harlan thought the society sick, and therefore hungered for a reality change. More than once it occurred to him that his own presence in the century, as a man not of that time, could fork its history. If his disturbing presence could only be made disturbing enough at some key point, a different branch of possibility would become real, a branch in which millions of pleasure-seeking women would find themselves transformed into true, pure-hearted mothers. They would be in another reality with all the memories that belonged with it, unable to tell, dream, or fancy that they had ever been anything else. Unfortunately, to do that, he would have to step outside the bounds of the spatio-temporal chart, and that was unthinkable. Even if it weren't, to step outside the bounds at random could change reality in many possible ways. It could be made worse. Only careful analysis and computing could properly pinpoint the nature of a reality change. Outwardly, whatever his private opinions, Harlan remained an observer, and the ideal observer was merely a set of sense-perceptive nerve patches attached to a report-writing mechanism. Between perception and report, there must be no intervention of emotion. Harlan's reports were perfection itself in that respect. Assistant computer Finge called him in after his second weekly report. "I congratulate you, observer," he said in a voice without warmth, "on the organization and clarity of your reports, but what do you really think?" Harlan sought refuge in an expression as blank as though chipped painstakingly out of native 95th century wood. He said, "I have no thoughts of my own in the matter." "Oh, come. You're from the 95th, and we both know what that means. Surely this century disturbs you?" Harlan shrugged. "Does anything in my reports lead you to think that I am disturbed?" It was near to impudence, and the drumming of Finge's blunt nails upon his desk showed it. Finge said, "Answer my question." Harlan said, "Sociologically, many facets of the century represent an extreme. The last 3 reality changes in the about when have accentuated that. Eventually, I suppose, the matter should be rectified. Extremes are never healthy." "Then you took the trouble to check the past realities of the century." "As an observer, I must check all pertinent facts." It was a standoff. Harlan, of course, did have the right and the duty to check those facts. Finge must know that. Every century was continually being shaken by reality changes. No observations, however painstaking, could ever stand for long without rechecking. It was standard procedure in eternity to have every century in a chronic state of being observed. And to observe properly, you must be able to present not only the facts of the current reality, but also of their relationship to those of previous realities. Yet it seemed obvious to Harlan that this was not merely unpleasantness on Finge's part, this probing of the observer's opinions. Finge seemed definitely hostile. At another time, Finge said to Harlan, having invaded the latter's small office to bring the news, "Your reports are creating a very favorable impression with the All-When Council." Harlan paused, uncertain, then mumbled, "Thank you." "All agree that you show an uncommon degree of penetration." "I do my best." Finge asked suddenly, "Have you ever met Senior Computer Twistle?" "Computer Twistle?" Harlan's eyes widened. "No, sir. Why do you ask?" "He seems particularly interested in your reports." Finge's round cheeks drew downward, sulkily, and he changed the subject. "To me, it seems that you have worked out a philosophy of your own, a viewpoint of history." Temptation tugged hard at Harlan. Vanity and caution battled, and the former won. "I've studied primitive history, sir." "Primitive history? At school?" "Not exactly, computer. On my own, it's my hobby. It's like watching history standing still, frozen. It can be studied in detail, whereas the centuries of eternity are always changing." He warmed up a trifle at the thought of it. "It's as though we were to take a series of stills from a book film and study each painstakingly. We would see a great deal we would miss if we just scanned the film as it went past. I think that helps me a great deal with my work." Finge stared at him in amazement, widened his eyes a little, and left with no further remark. Occasionally, thereafter, he brought up the subject of primitive history and accepted Harlan's reluctant comments with no decisive expression on his own plump face. Harlan was not sure whether to regret the whole matter or to regard it as a possible way of speeding his own advancement. He decided on the first alternative when, passing him one day in Corridor A, Finge said abruptly and in the hearing of others, "Great time, Harlan. Don't you ever smile?" The thought came, shockingly to Harlan, that Finge hated him. His own feeling for Finge approached something like detestation thereafter. 3 months of raking through the 482nd had exhausted most of its worthwhile meat, and when Harlan received a sudden call to Finge's office, he was not surprised. He was expecting a change in assignment. His final summary had been prepared days before. The 482nd was anxious to export more cellulose-based textiles to centuries which were deforested, such as the 1174th, but were unwilling to accept smoked fish in return. A long list of such items was contained in due order and with due analysis. He took the draft of the summary with him. But no mention of the 482nd was made. Instead, Finge introduced him to a withered and wrinkled little man with sparse white hair and a gnome-like face that, throughout the interview, was stamped with a perpetual smile. It varied between extremes of anxiety and joviality, but never quite disappeared. Between two of his yellow-stained fingers lay a burning cigarette. It was the first cigarette Harlan had ever seen. Otherwise he would have paid more attention to the man, less to the smoking cylinder, and been better prepared for Finge's introduction. Finge said, "Senior Computer Twistle, this is Observer Andrew Harlan." Harlan's eyes shifted in shock from the little man's cigarette to his face. Senior Computer Twistle said, in a high-pitched voice, "How do you do? So this is the young man who writes those excellent reports?" Harlan found no voice. Laban Twistle was a legend, a living myth. Laban Twistle was a man he should have recognized at once. He was the outstanding computer in eternity, which was another way of saying he was the most eminent eternal alive. He was the dean of the All-When Council. He had directed more reality changes than any men in the history of eternity. He had... Harlan's mind failed him altogether. He nodded his head with a doltish grin and said nothing. Twistle put his cigarette to his lips, puffed quickly, and took it away. "Leave us, Finge. I want to talk to the boy." Finge rose, murmured something, and left. Twistle said, "You seem nervous, boy. There is nothing to be nervous about." But meeting Twistle like that was a shock. It is always disconcerting to find that someone you have thought of as a giant is actually less than 5.5 feet tall. Could the brain of a genius actually fit behind the retreating, bald, smooth forehead? Was it sharp intelligence, or only good humor that beamed out of the little eyes that screwed up into 1,000 wrinkles? Harlan didn't know what to think. The cigarette seemed to obscure what small scrabble of intelligence he could collect. He flinched visibly as a puff of smoke reached him. Twistle's eyes narrowed as though he were trying to peer through the smoke haze, and he said, in horribly accented 10th millennial dialect, "Will you better feel if I and your self-dialect should speech, boy?" Harlan, brought to the sudden brink of hysterical laughter, said carefully, "I speak standard intertemporal quite well, sir." He said it in the intertemporal he and all other Eternals in his presence had used ever since his first months in eternity. "Nonsense," said Twistle imperiously. "I do not bother of intertemporal. My speech of 10 millennial is over than perfect." Harlan guessed that it had been some 40 years since Twistle had had to make use of local Wen dialects. But having made his point to his own satisfaction, apparently, he shifted to intertemporal and remained there. He said, "I would offer you a cigarette, but I'm certain you don't smoke. Smoking is approved of hardly anywhen in history. In fact, good cigarettes are made only in the 72nd, and mine have to be specially imported from there. I give you that hint in case you ever become a smoker. It is all very sad. Last week, I was stuck in the 123rd for 2 days. No smoking. I mean, even in the section of eternity devoted to the 123rd. The Eternals there have picked up the mores. If I lit a cigarette, it would have been like the sky collapsing. Sometimes I think I should like to calculate one great reality change and wipe out all the no-smoking taboos in all the centuries. Except that any reality change like that would make for wars in the 58th or a slave society in the 1000th. Always something." Harlan was first confused, then anxious. Surely these rattling irrelevancies must be hiding something. His throat felt a little constricted. He said, "May I ask why you've arranged to see me, sir?" "I like your reports, boy." There was a veiled glimmer of joy in Harlan's eyes, but he did not smile. "Thank you, sir." "It has a touch of the artist.
You are intuitive. You feel strongly. I think I know your proper position in eternity, and I have come to offer it to you."
Harlan thought, "I can't believe this." He held all triumph out of his voice. "You do me great honor, sir," he said. Whereupon Senior Computer Twistle, having come to the end of his cigarette, produced another in his left hand by some unnoted feat of legerdemain, and lit it. He said between puffs, "For time's sake, boy, you talk as though you rehearsed lines. Great honor, bah! Piffle, trash! Say what you feel in plain language. You're glad, hey?" "Yes, sir," said Harlan cautiously. "All right. You should be. How would you like to be a technician?" "A technician?" cried Harlan, leaping from his seat. Sit down, sit down. You seem surprised." "I hadn't expected to be a technician, Computer Twistle." "No," said Twistle dryly. "Somehow no one ever does. They expect anything but that. Yet technicians are hard to find, and are always in demand. Not a section in eternity has what it considers enough." "I don't think I'm suited." "You mean you're not suited to take a job with trouble in it? By time! If you are devoted to eternity, as I believe you are, you won't mind that. So the fools will avoid you, and you will feel ostracized. You will grow used to that. And you will have the satisfaction of knowing you are needed, and needed badly. By me." "By you, sir? By you particularly?" "Yes." An element of shrewdness entered the old man's smile. "You are not to be just a technician. You will be my personal technician. You will have special status. How does that sound now?" Harlan said, "I don't know, sir. I may not qualify." Twistle shook his head firmly. "I need you. I need just you. Your reports assure me you have what I need up here." He tapped his forehead quickly with a ridge-nailed forefinger. "Your record as cub is good. The sections for which you have observed reported favorably. Finally, Finge's report was most suitable of all." Harlan was honestly startled. Computer Finge's report was favorable? "You didn't expect that?" "I don't know." "Well, boy, I didn't say it was favorable. I said it was suitable. As a matter of fact, Finge's report was not favorable. He recommended that you be removed from all duties connected with reality changes. He suggested it wasn't safe to keep you anywhere but in maintenance." Harlan reddened. "What were his reasons for saying so, sir?" "It seems you have a hobby, boy. You are interested in primitive history, eh?" He gestured expansively with his cigarette, and Harlan, forgetting in his anger to control his breathing, inhaled a cloud of smoke and coughed helplessly. Twistle regarded the young observer's coughing spell benignly and said, "Isn't that so?" Harlan began. "Computer Finge had no right—" Now. I told you what was in the report because it hinges on the purpose I need you most for. Actually, the report was confidential, and you are to forget I told you what was in it. Permanently, boy." "But what's wrong with being interested in primitive history?" "Finge thinks your interest in it shows a strong wish to time. You understand me, boy?" Harlan did. It was impossible to avoid picking up psychiatric lingo. That phrase, above all. Every member of eternity was supposed to have a strong drive, the stronger for being officially suppressed in all its manifestations, to return, not necessarily to his own time, but at least to some one definite time, to become part of a century, rather than to remain a wanderer through them all. Of course, in most Eternals, the drive remained safely hidden in the unconscious. "I don't think that's the case," said Harlan. "Nor I. In fact, I think your hobby is interesting and valuable. As I said, it's why I want you. I want you to teach a cub I shall bring to you all you know and all you can learn about primitive history. In between, you will also be my personal technician. You'll start in a few days. Is that agreeable?" Agreeable? To have official permission to learn all he could about the days before eternity? To be personally associated with the greatest Eternal of them all? Even the nasty fact of technician status seemed bearable under those conditions. His caution, however, did not entirely fail him. He said, "If it's necessary for the good of eternity, sir." "For the good of eternity?" cried the gnomish computer in sudden excitement. He threw his cigarette butt from him with such energy that it hit the far wall and bounced off in a shower of sparks. "I need you for the existence of eternity." Chapter 3. Cub. Harlan had been in the 575th for weeks before he met Brinsley Sheridan Cooper. He had time to grow used to his new quarters and to the antisepsis of glass and porcelain. He learned to wear the technician's mark with only moderate shrinking, and to refrain from making things worse by standing so that the insignia was hidden against a wall, or was covered by the interposition of some object he was carrying. Others smiled disdainfully when that was done, and turned colder, as though they suspected an attempt to invade their friendship on false pretenses. Senior Computer Twistle brought him problems daily. Harlan studied them, and wrote his analyses in drafts that were 4 times rewritten, the last version being handed in reluctantly even so. Twistle would appraise them, and nod and say, "Good, good." Then his cold blue eyes would dart quickly at Harlan, and his smile would narrow a bit as he said, "I'll test this guess on the computerplex." He always called the analysis a guess. He never told Harlan the result of the computerplex check, and Harlan dared not ask. He was despondent over the fact that he was never asked to put any of his own analyses into action. Did that mean that the computerplex was not checking him, that he had been choosing the wrong item for the induction of a reality change, that he did not have the knack of seeing the minimum necessary change in an indicated range? It was not until later that he grew sufficiently sophisticated to have the phrase come rolling off his tongue as MNC. One day, Twistle came in with an abashed individual who seemed scarcely to dare raise his eyes to meet Harlan's. Twistle said, "Technician Harlan, this is Cub B.S. Cooper." Automatically, Harlan said, "Hello," weighed the man's appearance, and was unimpressed. The fellow was on the shortish side, with dark hair parted in the middle. His chin was narrow, his eyes an indefinite light brown, his ears a little large, and his fingernails bitten. Twistle said, "This is the boy to whom you will be teaching primitive history." "Great time," said Harlan, with suddenly increased interest. "Hello." He had almost forgotten. Twistle said, "Arrange a schedule with him that will suit you, Harlan. If you can manage 2 afternoons a week, I think that would be fine. Use your own method of teaching him. I'll leave that to you. If you should need book films or old documents, tell me, and if they exist in eternity or in any part of time that can be reached, we'll get them. Eh, boy?" He plucked a lit cigarette out of nowhere, as it always seemed, and the air reeked with smoke. Harlan coughed, and from the twisting of the cub's mouth it was quite obvious that the latter would have done the same had he dared. After Twistle left, Harlan said, "Well, sit down." He hesitated a moment, then added determinedly, "Son, sit down, son. My office isn't much, but it's yours whenever we're together." Harlan was almost flooded with eagerness. This project was his. Primitive history was something that was all his own. The cub raised his eyes, for the first time, really, and said stumblingly, "You are a technician." A considerable part of Harlan's excitement and warmth died. "What of it?" "Nothing," said the cub. You heard Computer Twistle address me as technician, didn't you?" "Yes, sir." "Did you think it was a slip of the tongue, something too bad to be true?" "No, sir." "What's wrong with your speech?" Harlan asked brutally, and even as he did so, he felt shame nudge him. Cooper blushed painfully. "I'm not very good at standard intertemporal." "Why not? How long have you been a cub?" "Less than 1 year, sir." 1 year? How old are you, for time's sake?" 24 physio years, sir." Harlan stared. "Are you trying to tell me that they took you into eternity at 23? "Yes, sir." Harlan sat down and rubbed his hands together. That just wasn't done. 15 to 16 was the age of entrance into eternity. What was this? A new kind of testing of himself on the part of Twistle? He said, "Sit down and let's get started. Your name in full and your home when." The cub stammered.
Brinsley Sheridan Cooper of the 78th, sir.
Harlan almost softened. That was close. It was only 17 centuries down when from his own home when. Almost a temporal neighbor. He said, "Are you interested in primitive history?"
Computer Twistle asked me to learn. I don't know much about it.
What else are you learning?
Mathematics, temporal engineering. I'm just getting the fundamentals so far. Back in the 78th, I was a speedy-vac repairman.
There was no point in asking the nature of a speedy-vac. It might be a suction cleaner, a computing machine, a type of spray painter, anything. Harlan wasn't particularly interested. He said, "Do you know anything about history? Any kind of history?"
I studied European history.
Your particular political unit, I take it.
I was born in Europe, yes. Mostly, of course, they taught us modern history. After the revolutions of 54, 75-54, that is.
All right. First thing you do is to forget it. It doesn't mean anything. The history they try to teach timers changes with every reality change. Not that they realize that. In each reality, their history is the only history. That's what's so different about primitive history. That's the beauty of it. No matter what any of us does, it exists precisely as it has always existed. Columbus and Washington, Mussolini and Hereford, they all exist. Cooper smiled feebly. He brushed his little finger across his upper lip, and for the first time, Harlan noticed a trace of bristle there as though the cub were cultivating a mustache.
Cooper said, "I can't quite get used to it, all the time I've been here."
Get used to what?
Being 500 centuries away from home when?
I'm nearly that myself. I'm 95th.
That's another thing. You're older than I am, and yet I'm 17 centuries older than you in another way. I can be your great, and so on, grandfather.
What's the difference? Suppose you are. Well, it takes getting used to. There was a trace of rebellion in the cub's voice. It does for all of us, said Harlan callously, and began talking about the primitives. By the time 3 hours had passed, he was deep in an explanation concerning the reasons why there were centuries before the first century.
But isn't the first century first?
Cooper had asked plaintively. Harlan ended by giving the cub a book, not a good one really, but one that would serve as a beginning. I'll get you better stuff as we go along, he said. By the end of a week, Cooper's mustache had become a pronounced dark bristle that made him look 10 years older and accentuated the narrowness of his chin. On the whole, Harlan decided, it would not be an improvement, that mustache. Cooper said,
"I finished your book."
"What did you think of it?"
"In a way."
There was a long pause. Cooper began over again.
"Parts of the later primitive was something like the 78th. It made me think of home, you know. Twice I dreamed about my wife."
Harlan exploded. "Your wife?"
"I was married before I came here."
"Great time. Did they bring your wife across too?" Cooper shook his head.
"I don't even know if she's been changed in the last year. If she has, I suppose she's not really my wife now."
Harlan recovered. Of course, if the cub were 23 years old when he was taken into eternity, it was quite possible that he might have been married. One thing unprecedented led to another. What was going on? Once modifications were introduced into the rules, it wouldn't be a long step to the point where everything would decline into a mass of incoherency. Eternity was too finely balanced an arrangement to endure modification. It was his anger on behalf of eternity, perhaps, that put an unintended harshness into Harlan's next words. "I hope you're not planning on going back to the 78th to check on her." The cub lifted his head, and his eyes were firm and steady.
"No."
Harlan shifted uneasily. "Good. You have no family, nothing. You're an eternal, and don't ever think of anyone you knew in time." Cooper's lips thinned, and his accent stood out sharply in his quick words.
"You're speaking like a technician."
Harlan's fists clenched along the sides of his desk. He said hoarsely, "What do you imply? I'm a technician, so I make the changes?
So I defend them and demand that you accept them? Look, kid, you haven't been here a year. You can't speak intertemporal. You're all misgeared on time and reality, but you think you know all about technicians and how to kick them in the teeth. I'm sorry, said Cooper quickly. I didn't mean to offend you. No, who offends a technician? You just hear everyone else talking, is that it? They say cold as a technician's heart, don't they? They say a trillion personalities change, just a technician's yawn, maybe a few other things. What's the answer, Mr. Cooper? Does it make you feel sophisticated to join in? It makes you a big man? A big wheel in eternity? I said I'm sorry. All right. I just want you to know I've been a technician for less than a month and I personally have never induced a reality change. Now let's get on with business. Senior Computer Twistle called Andrew Harlan to his office the next day. He said, "How would you like to go on an MNC, boy?" It was almost too apposite. All that morning, Harlan had been regretting his cowardly disclaimer of personal involvement in the technician's work. His childish cry of, "I haven't done anything wrong yet, so don't blame me." It amounted to an admission that there was something wrong about a technician's work, and that he himself was blameless only because he was too new at the game to have had time to be a criminal. He welcomed the chance to kill that excuse now. It would be almost a penance. He could say to Cooper, "Yes, because of something I have done, this many millions of people are new personalities, but it was necessary, and I am proud to have been the cause." So Harlan said joyfully, "I'm ready, sir." Good. You'll be glad to know, boy," a puff, and the cigarette tip glowed brilliantly, "that every one of your analyses checked out with high-order accuracy." Thank you, sir. They were analyses now, thought Harlan, not guesses. You've got a talent. Quite a touch, boy. I look for great things. And we can begin with this one, 223rd. Your statement that a jammed vehicle clutch would supply the necessary fork without undesirable side effects is perfectly correct. Will you jam it? Yes, sir. That was Harlan's true initiation into technicianhood. After that, he was more than just a man with a rose-red badge. He had handled reality. He had tampered with a mechanism during a quick few minutes taken out of the 223rd, and, as a result, a young man did not reach a lecture on mechanics he had meant to attend. He never went in for solar engineering, consequently, and a perfectly simple device was delayed in its development a crucial 10 years. A war in the 224th, amazingly enough, was moved out of reality as a result. Wasn't that good? What if personalities were changed? The new personalities were as human as the old, and as deserving of life. If some lives were shortened, more were lengthened, and made happier. A great work of literature, a monument of man's intellect and feeling was never written in the new reality, but several copies were preserved in eternity's libraries, were they not? And new creative works had come into existence, had they not? Yet that night, Harlan spent hours in a hot agony of wakefulness, and when he finally drowsed, groggily, he did something he hadn't done in years. He dreamed of his mother. Despite the weakness of such a beginning, a physio year was sufficient to make Harlan known throughout eternity as Twistle's technician, and with more than a trace of ill humor as the Wonder Boy and the Never Wrong. His contact with Cooper became almost comfortable. They never grew completely friendly. If Cooper could have brought himself to make advances, Harlan might not have known how to respond. Nevertheless, they worked well together, and Cooper's interest in primitive history grew to the point where it nearly rivaled Harlan's. One day, Harlan said to Cooper, "Look, Cooper, would you mind coming in tomorrow instead? I've got to get up to the 3000 sometime this week to check on an observation, and the man I want to see is free this afternoon." Cooper's eyes lit up, hungrily. "Why can't I come?" "Do you want to?" "Sure. I've never been in a kettle except when they brought me here from the 78th, and I didn't know what was happening at the time." Harlan was accustomed to using the kettle in Shaft C, which was, by unwritten custom, reserved for technicians along its entire, immeasurable length through the centuries. Cooper showed no embarrassment at being led there. He stepped into the kettle without hesitation and took his seat on the curved molding that completely circled it. When Harlan, however, had activated the field and kicked the kettle into upwind motion, Cooper's face screwed into an almost comic expression of surprise. "I don't feel a thing," he said. "Is anything wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. You're not feeling anything because you're not really moving. You're being kicked along the temporal extension of the kettle. In fact," Harlan said, growing didactic, "at the moment you and I aren't matter really, in spite of appearances. 100 men could be using this same kettle, moving, if you can call it that, at various velocities in either time direction, passing through one another and so on. The laws of the ordinary universe just don't apply to the kettle shafts." Cooper's mouth quirked a bit, and Harlan thought uneasily, "The kid's taking temporal engineering and knows more about this than I do. Why don't I shut up and stop making a fool of myself?" He retreated into silence and stared somberly at Cooper. The younger man's mustache had been full-grown for months. It drooped, framing his mouth in what Eternals called Melanson hairline, because the only photograph known to be authentic of the temporal field inventor, and that a poor one and out of focus, showed him with just such a mustache. For that reason, it maintained a certain popularity among Eternals, even though it did few of them justice. Cooper's eyes were fixed on the shifting numbers that marked the passing of the centuries with respect to themselves. He said, "How far upwind does the kettle shaft go?" "Haven't they taught you that?" "They've hardly mentioned the kettles." Harlan shrugged. "There's no end to eternity. The shaft goes on forever." "How far upwind have you gone?" "This will be the uppest. Dr. Twistle has been up to the 50,000s. "Great time," whispered Cooper. "Well, that's still nothing. Some Eternals have been up past the 150,000th century." "What's that like?" "Like nothing at all," said Harlan morosely. "Lots of life, but none of it human. Man is gone." "Dead? Wiped out?" "I don't know that anyone exactly knows." "Can't something be done to change that?" "Well, from the 70,000s on," began Harlan, then ended abruptly. "Oh, to time with it. Change the subject." If there was one subject about which Eternals were almost superstitious, it was the hidden centuries, the time between the 70,000th and the 150,000th. It was a subject that was rarely mentioned. It was only Harlan's close association with Twistle that accounted for his own small knowledge of the era. What it amounted to was that Eternals couldn't pass into time in all those thousands of centuries. The doors between eternity and time were impenetrable. Why? No one knew. Harlan imagined, from some casual remarks of Twistle's, that attempts had been made to change the reality in the centuries just downwind from the 70,000th, but without adequate observation beyond the 70,000th, not much could be done. Twistle had laughed a bit one time and said, "We'll get through some day. Meanwhile, 70,000 centuries is quite enough to take care of." It did not sound wholly convincing. "What happens to eternity after the 150,000th?" asked Cooper. Harlan sighed. The subject, apparently, was not to be changed. "Nothing," he said. "The sections are there, but there are no Eternals in it, anywhere after the 70,000th. The sections keep on going for millions of centuries till all life is gone, and past that, too, till the sun becomes a nova, and past that, too. There isn't any end to eternity. That's why it's called eternity." "The sun does become a nova, then?" "It certainly does. Eternity couldn't exist if that weren't so. Nova Sol is our power supply. Listen, do you know how much power is required to set up a temporal field? Melanson's first field was 2 seconds from extreme downwind to extreme upwind, and big enough to hold not more than a match head, and that took a nuclear power plant's complete output for one day. It took nearly 100 years to set up a hair-thin temporal field far enough upwind to be able to tap the radiant power of the nova so that a field could be built big enough to hold a man." Cooper sighed. "I wish they would get to the point where they stopped making me learn equations and field mechanics and start telling me some of the interesting stuff. Now, if I had lived in Melanson's time—" "You would have learned nothing. He lived in the 24th, but eternity didn't start till late in the 27th. Inventing the field isn't the same as constructing eternity, you know, and the rest of the 24th didn't have the slightest inkling of what Melanson's invention signified. He was ahead of his generation then.
Very much so. He not only invented the temporal field, but he described the basic relationships that made eternity possible and predicted almost every aspect of it except for the reality change. Quite closely, too. But I think we're pulling to a halt, Cooper. After you. They stepped out. Harlan had never seen senior computer Laban Twistle angry before. People always said that he was incapable of any emotion, that he was an unsouled fixture of eternity to the point where he had forgotten the exact number of his home-when century. People said that at an early age his heart had atrophied, and that a hand computer similar to the model he carried, always in his trouser pocket, had taken its place. Twistle did nothing to deny these rumors. In fact, most people guessed that he believed them himself. So even while Harlan bent before the force of the angry blast that struck him, he had room in his mind to be amazed at the fact that Twistle could display anger. He wondered if Twistle would be mortified in some calmer aftermath to realize that his hand-computer heart had betrayed him by exposing itself as only a poor thing of muscle and valves subject to the twists of emotion. Twistle said, in part, his old voice creaking, "Father Time, boy, are you on the All-When Council? Do you give the orders around here? Do you tell me what to do, or do I tell you what to do? Are you making arrangements for all kettle trips now?" He interrupted himself with occasional exclamations of, "Answer me!" then continued pouring more questions into the boiling, interrogative cauldron. He said finally, "If you ever get above yourself this way again, I'll have you on plumbing repair, and for good. Do you understand me?" Harlan, pale with his own gathering embarrassment, said, "I was never told that Cub Cooper was not to be taken on the kettle." The explanation did not act as an emollient. "What kind of excuse is a double negative, boy? You were never told not to get him drunk. You were never told not to shave him bald. You were never told not to skewer him with a fine-edged Tav curve. Father Time, boy, what were you told to do with him?" "I was told to teach him primitive history." "Then do so. Do nothing more than that." Twistle dropped his cigarette and ground it savagely underfoot, as though it were the face of a lifelong enemy. "I'd like to point out, computer," said Harlan, "that many centuries under the current reality somewhat resemble specific eras of primitive history in one or more respects. It had been my intention to take him out to those times, under careful spatio-temporal charting, of course, as a form of field trip." "What? Listen, you chucklehead, don't you ever intend to ask my permission for anything? That's out. Just teach him primitive history. No field trips, no laboratory experiments either. Next you'll be changing reality just to show him how." Harlan licked his dry lips with a dry tongue, muttered a resentful acquiescence, and eventually was allowed to leave. It took weeks for his hurt feelings to heal over somewhat. Chapter 4. Computer. Harlan had been 2 years a technician when he re-entered the 482nd for the first time since leaving with Twistle. He found it almost unrecognizable. It had not changed. He had. 2 years of technicianhood had meant a number of things. In one sense, it had increased his feeling of stability. He had no longer to learn a new language, get used to new styles of clothing and new ways of life with every new observation project. On the other hand, it had resulted in a withdrawal on his own part. He had almost forgotten now the camaraderie that united all the rest of the specialists in eternity. Most of all, he had developed the feeling of the power of being a technician. He held the fate of millions in his fingertips, and if one must walk lonely because of it, one could also walk proudly. So he could stare coldly at the communications man behind the entry desk of the 482nd and announce himself in clipped syllables. "Andrew Harlan, technician, reporting to Computer Finge for temporary assignment to the 482nd, disregarding the quick glance from the middle-aged man he faced. It was what some people called the technician glance, a quick, involuntary sidelong peek at the rose-red shoulder emblem of the technician, then an elaborate attempt not to look at it again. Harlan stared at the other's shoulder emblem. It was not the yellow of the computer, the green of the life plotter, the blue of the sociologist,
or the white of the observer. It was not the specialist's solid color at all. It was simply a blue bar on white. The man was communications, a sub-branch of maintenance, not a specialist at all. And he gave the technician glance too. Harlan said a little sadly, "Well?" Communications said quickly, "I'm ringing Computer Finch, sir." Harlan remembered the 482nd as solid and massive, but now it seemed almost squalid. Harlan had grown used to the glass and porcelain of the 575th, to its fetish of cleanliness. He had grown accustomed to a world of whiteness and clarity, broken by sparse patches of light pastel. The heavy plaster swirls of the 482nd, its splashy pigments, its areas of painted metal, were almost repulsive. Even Finch seemed different, less than life-size, somewhat. 2 years earlier, to observer Harlan, Finch's every gesture had seemed sinister and powerful. Now, from the lofty and isolated heights of technicianhood, the man seemed pathetic and lost. Harlan watched him as he leafed through a sheaf of foils and got ready to look up, with the air of someone who is beginning to think he has made his visitor wait the duly required amount of time. Finch was from an energy-centered century in the 600s. Twistle had told him that, and it explained a good deal. Finch's flashes of ill temper could easily be the result of the natural insecurity of a heavy man used to the firmness of field forces and unhappy to be dealing with nothing more than flimsy matter. His tiptoeing walk, Harlan remembered Finch's cat-like tread well. Often he would look up from his desk, see Finch standing there staring at him. His approach, having been unheard, was no longer something sly and sneaking, but rather the fearful and reluctant tread of one who lives in the constant, if unconscious, fear that the flooring would break under his weight. Harlan thought, with a pleasant condescension, "The man is poorly adjusted to the section. Reassignment is probably the only thing that would help him." Finch said, "Greetings, Technician Harlan." "Greetings, Computer," said Harlan. Finch said, "It seems that in the 2 years since—" "2 physio years," said Harlan. Finch looked up in surprise. 2 physio years, of course. In eternity there was no time, as one ordinarily thought of time, in the universe outside. But men's bodies grew older, and that was the unavoidable measure of time, even in the absence of meaningful physical phenomena. Physiologically, time passed, and in a physio year within eternity, a man grew as much older as he would have in an ordinary year in time. Yet even the most pedantic eternal remembered the distinction only rarely. It was too convenient to say, "See you tomorrow," or "I missed you yesterday," or "I will see you next week," as though there were a tomorrow, or a yesterday, or a last week in any but a physiological sense. And the instincts of humanity were catered to by having the activities of eternity tailored to an arbitrary 24 physio-hour day, with a solemn assumption of day and night, today and tomorrow. Finch said, "In the 2 physio years since you left, a crisis has gradually gathered about the 482nd, a rather peculiar one, a delicate one, almost unprecedented. We need accurate observation now as we never have needed it before." "And you want me to observe?" "Yes. In a way, it's a waste of talent to ask a technician to do a job of observation, but your previous observations, for clarity and insight, were perfect. We need that again. Now I'll just sketch in a few details." What those details were, Harlan was not to find out just then. Finch spoke, but the door opened, and Harlan did not hear him. He stared at the person who entered. It was not that Harlan had never seen a girl in eternity before. Never was too strong a word. Rarely, yes, but not never. But a girl such as this, and in eternity. Harlan had seen many women in his passages through time, but in time they were only objects to him, like walls and balls, barrows and harrows, kittens and mittens. They were facts to be observed. In eternity, a girl was a different matter, and one like this. She was dressed in the style of the upper classes of the 482nd, which meant transparent sheathing and not very much else above the waist, and flimsy, knee-length trousers below. The latter, while opaque enough, hinted delicately at gluteal curves. Her hair was glossily dark and shoulder-length, her lips redly penciled thin above and full below in an exaggerated pout. Her upper eyelids and her earlobes were tinted a pale rose, and the rest of her youthful, almost girlish face was a startlingly milky white. Jeweled pendants descended forward from mid-shoulder to tinkle now this side, now that, of the graceful breasts to which they drew attention. She took her seat at a desk in the corner of Finch's office, lifting her eyelashes only once to sweep her dark glance across Harlan's face. When Harlan heard Finch's voice again, the computer was saying, "You'll get all this in an official report, and meanwhile you can have your old office and sleeping quarters." Harlan found himself outside Finch's office without quite remembering the details of his leaving. Presumably he had walked out. The emotion within him that was easiest to recognize was anger. By time! Finch ought not to be allowed to do this. It was bad for morale. It made a mockery. He stopped himself, unclenched his fist, unclamped his jaw. Let's see now. His footsteps sounded sharply in his own ear as he strode firmly toward the communications man behind the desk. Communications looked up without quite meeting his eye and said cautiously, "Yes, sir?" Harlan said, "There's a woman at a desk in Computer Finch's office. Is she new here?" He had meant to ask it casually. He had meant to make it a bored, indifferent question. It rang out instead like a pair of cymbals clashing. But it roused Communications. The look in his eye became something that made all men kin. It even embraced the technician, drew him in as a fellow. Communications said, "You mean the babe? Wow! Isn't she built like a force field latrine, though?" Harlan stammered a bit. "Just answer my question." Communications stared, and some of his steam evaporated. He said, "She's new. She's a timer." "What's her job?" A slow smile crept over Communications' face and grew into a leer. "She's supposed to be the boss's secretary. Her name is Noyes Lambent." "All right." Harlan turned on his heel and left. Harlan's first observation trip into the 482nd came the next day, but it lasted for 30 minutes only. It was obviously only an orientation trip, intended to get him into the feel of things. He entered it for an hour and a half the next day, and not at all on the third. He occupied his time in working his way through his original reports, relearning his own knowledge, brushing up on the language system of the time, accustoming himself to the local costumes again. One reality change had hit the 482nd, but it was very minor. A political clique that had been in was now out, but there seemed no change in the society otherwise. Without quite realizing it, he slipped into the habit of searching his old reports for information on the aristocracy. Surely he had made observations. He had, but they were impersonal, from a distance. His data concerned them as a class, not as individuals. Of course, his spatio-temporal charts had never demanded or even permitted him to observe the aristocracy from within. What the reasons for that might have been was beyond the purview of an observer. He was impatient with himself at feeling curiosity concerning that now. During those 3 days, he had caught glimpses of the girl, Noyes Lambent, 4 times. At first, he had been aware only of her clothes and her ornaments. Now he noticed that she was 5'6" in height, half a head shorter than himself, yet slim enough and with a carriage erect and graceful enough to give an impression of height. She was older than she first seemed, approaching 30 perhaps, certainly over 25. She was quiet and reserved, smiled at him once when he passed her in the corridor, then lowered her eyes. Harlan drew aside to avoid touching her, then walked on feeling angry. By the close of the 3rd day, Harlan was beginning to feel that his duty as an Eternal left him only one course of action. Doubtless, her position was a comfortable one for herself. Doubtless, Finch was within the letter of the law, yet Finch's indiscretion in the matter, his carelessness, certainly went against the spirit of the law, and something should be done about it. Harlan decided that, after all, There wasn't a man in eternity he disliked quite as much as Finge. The excuses he had found for the man only a few days before vanished. On the morning of the fourth day, Harlan asked for and received permission to see Finge privately. He walked in with a determined step and, to his own surprise, made his point instantly. "Computer Finge, I suggest that Miss Lambent be returned to time." Finge's eyes narrowed. He nodded toward a chair, placed clasped hands under his soft, round chin, and showed some of his teeth. "Well, sit down, sit down. You find Miss Lambent incompetent? Unsuitable? As to her incompetence and unsuitability, Computer, I cannot say. It depends on the uses to which she is put, and I have put her to none. But you must realize that she is bad for the morale of this section." Finge stared at him distantly, as though his computer's mind were weighing abstractions beyond the reach of an ordinary Eternal. "In what way is she hurting morale, Technician?" "There is no real necessity for you to ask," said Harlan, his anger deepening. "Her costume is exhibitionistic. Her—" Wait. Now wait a while, Harlan. You've been an observer in this era. You know her clothes are standard costume for the 482nd. In her own surroundings, in her own cultural milieu, I would have no fault to find, though I'll say right now that her costume is extreme even for the 482nd. You'll allow me to be the judge of that. Here in eternity, a person such as she is certainly out of place." Finge nodded his head slowly. He actually seemed to be enjoying himself. Harlan stiffened. Finge said, "She is here for a deliberate purpose. She is performing an essential function. It is only temporary. Try to endure her meanwhile." Harlan's jaw quivered. He had protested and was being fobbed off. To hell with caution. He would speak his mind. He said, "I can imagine what the woman's essential function is. To keep her so openly will not be allowed to pass." He turned stiffly, walked to the door. Finge's voice stopped him. "Technician," Finge said, "your relationship with Twistle may have given you a distorted notion about your own importance. Correct that. And meanwhile, tell me, Technician, have you ever had a—" He hesitated, seeming to pick among words. "Girlfriend?" With painstaking and insulting accuracy, back still turned, Harlan quoted, "In the interest of avoiding emotional entanglements with time, an Eternal may not marry. In the interest of avoiding emotional entanglements with family, an Eternal may not have children." The computer said gravely, "I didn't ask about marriage or children." Harlan quoted further, "Temporary liaisons may be made with timers only after application with the Central Charting Board of the All-Wen Council for an appropriate life plot of the timer concerned. Liaisons may be conducted thereafter only according to the requirements of specific spatio-temporal charting." Quite true. Have you ever applied for temporary liaison, Technician? No, Computer. Do you intend to? No, Computer. Perhaps you ought to. It would give you a greater breadth of view. You would become less concerned about the details of a woman's costume, less disturbed about her possible personal relations with other Eternals. Harlan left, speechless with rage. He found it almost impossible to perform his near-daily trek into the 482nd, the longest continuous period remaining something under 2 hours. He was upset, and he knew why. Finge and his coarse advice concerning liaisons with timers. Liaisons existed, everyone knew that. Eternity had always been aware of the necessity for compromising with human appetites. To Harlan, the phrase carried a quivery repulsion, but the restrictions involved in choosing mistresses made the compromise anything but lax, anything but generous. And those who were lucky enough to qualify for such an arrangement were expected to be most discreet about it, out of common decency and consideration for the majority. Among the lower classes of Eternals, particularly among maintenance, there were always the rumors, half hopeful, half resentful, of women imported on a more or less permanent basis for the obvious reasons. Always, rumor pointed to the computers and life plotters as the benefiting groups. They, and only they, could decide which women could be abstracted from time without danger of significant reality change. Less sensational, and therefore less tongue-worthy, were the stories concerning the timer employees that every section engaged temporarily, when spatio-temporal analysis permitted, to perform the tedious tasks of cooking, cleaning, and heavy labor. But a timer, and such a timer, employed as secretary, could only mean that Finge was thumbing his nose at the ideals that made eternity what it was. Regardless of the facts of life to which the practical man of eternity made a perfunctory obeisance, it remained true that the ideal eternal was a dedicated man living for the mission he had to perform, for the betterment of reality and the improvement of the sum of human happiness. Harlan liked to think that eternity was like the monasteries of primitive times. He dreamed that night that he spoke to Twistle about the matter, and that Twistle, the ideal eternal, shared his horror. He dreamed of a broken Finge, stripped of rank. He dreamed of himself with the yellow computer's insignia, instituting a new regime in the 482nd, ordering Finge grandly to a new position in maintenance. Twistle sat next to him, smiling with admiration, as he drew up a new organizational chart, neat, orderly, consistent, and asked Noyes Lambent to distribute copies. But Noyes Lambent was nude, and Harlan woke up, trembling and ashamed. He met the girl in a corridor one day and stood aside, eyes averted, to let her pass. But she remained standing, looking at him, until he had to look up and meet her eyes. She was all color and life, and Harlan was conscious of a faint perfume about her. She said, "You're Technician Harlan, aren't you?" His impulse was to snub her, to force his way past, but, after all, he told himself, all this wasn't her fault. Besides, to move past her now would mean touching her. So he nodded briefly. "Yes, I'm told you're quite an expert on our time." "I have been in it." "I would love to talk to you about it someday." "I am busy. I wouldn't have time." "But, Mr. Harlan, surely you could find time someday." She smiled at him. Harlan said in a desperate whisper, "Will you pass, please? Or will you stand aside to let me pass? Please." She moved by with a slow swing of her hips that brought blood tingling to his embarrassed cheeks. He was angry at her for embarrassing him, angry at himself for being embarrassed, and angry, most of all, for some obscure reason, at Finge. Finge called him in at the end of 2 weeks. On his desk was a sheet of perforated flimsy, the length and intricacy of which told Harlan at once that this concerned no half-hour excursion into time. Finge said, "Would you sit down, Harlan, and scan this thing right now? No, not by eye. Use the machine." Harlan lifted indifferent eyebrows and inserted the sheet carefully between the lips of the scanner on Finge's desk. Slowly, it passed into the intestines of the machine and, as it did so, the perforation pattern was translated into words that appeared on the cloudy white rectangle that was the visual attachment. Somewhere about midpoint, Harlan's hand shot out and disconnected the scanner. He yanked the flimsy out with a force that tore its tough cellulite structure. Finge said calmly, "I have another copy." But Harlan was holding the remnants between thumb and forefinger as though it might explode. "Computer Finge, there is some mistake. Surely I am not to be expected to use the home of this woman as base for a near-week's stay in time." The computer pursed his lips. "Why not? If the spatio-temporal requirements are such. If there is a personal problem involved between yourself and Miss Lamb—" "No personal problem at all," interposed Harlan hotly. "Some kind of problem, certainly. In the circumstances, I will go as far as to explain certain aspects of the observational problem. This is not to be taken as a precedent, of course." Harlan sat, motionless. He was thinking hard and fast. Ordinarily, professional pride would have forced Harlan to disdain explanation. An observer, or technician, for that matter, did his job without question, and ordinarily a computer would never dream of offering explanation. Here, however, was something unusual. Harlan had complained concerning the girl, the so-called secretary. Finge was afraid the complaint might go further. The guilty fleeth when no man pursueth, thought Harlan with grim satisfaction, and tried to remember where he had read that phrase. Finge's strategy was obvious, therefore. By stationing Harlan in the woman's dwelling place, he would be ready to make counter-accusations if matters went far enough. Harlan's value as a witness against him would be destroyed. And, of course, he would have to have some specious explanation for placing Harlan in such a place, and this would be it. Harlan listened with barely hidden contempt. Finge said, "As you know, the various centuries are aware of the existence of eternity. They know that we supervise intertemporal trade. They consider that to be our chief function, which is good. They have a dim knowledge that we are also here to prevent catastrophe from striking mankind. That is more a superstition than anything else, but it is more or less correct, and good, too. We supply the generations with a mass father image and a certain feeling of security. You see all that, don't you?" Harlan thought, "Does the man think I'm still a cub?" But he nodded briefly. Finge went on. "There are some things, however, they must not know. Prime among them, of course, is the manner in which we alter reality when necessary. The insecurity such knowledge would arouse would be most harmful. It is always necessary to breed out of reality any factors that might lead to such knowledge, and we have never been troubled with it. However, there are always other undesirable beliefs about eternity which spring up from time to time in one century or another. Usually the dangerous beliefs are those which concentrate particularly in the ruling classes of an era, the classes that have most contact with us and at the same time carry the important weight of what is called public opinion." Finge paused as though he expected Harlan to offer some comment or ask some question. Harlan did neither. Finge continued. "Ever since the reality change 433 to 486, serial number F2, which took place about a physio-year ago, there has been evidence of the bringing into reality of such an undesirable belief. I have come to certain conclusions about the nature of that belief and have presented them to the All-When Council. The Council is reluctant to accept them, since they depend upon the realization of an alternate in the computing pattern of an extremely low probability. Before acting on my recommendation, they insist on confirmation by direct observation. It's a most delicate job, which is why I recalled you, and why Computer Twistle allowed you to be recalled. Another thing I did was to locate a member of the current aristocracy who thought it would be thrilling or exciting to work in eternity. I placed her in this office and kept her under close observation to see if she was suitable for our purpose." Harlan thought, "Close observation, yes." Again, his anger focused itself on Finge rather than upon the woman. Finge was still speaking. "By all standards, she is suitable. We will now return her to her time. Using her dwelling as a base, you will be able to study the social life of her circle. Do you understand now the reason I had the girl here and the reason I want you in her house?" Harlan said with an almost open irony, "I understand quite well, I assure you." "Then you will accept this mission." Harlan left with the fire of battle burning inside his chest. Finge was not going to outsmart him. He was not going to make a fool of him. Surely it was that fire of battle, the determination to outwit Finge, that caused him to experience an eagerness, almost an exhilaration, at the thought of this next excursion into the 482nd. Surely it was nothing else. Chapter 5. Timer. Neues Lambent's estate was fairly isolated, yet within easy reach of one of the larger cities of the century. Harlan knew that city well. He knew it better than any of its inhabitants could. In his exploratory observations into this reality, he had visited every quarter of the city and every decade within the purview of the section. He knew the city both in space and time. He could piece it together, view it as an organism, living and growing, with its catastrophes and recoveries, its gaieties and troubles. Now, He was in a given week of time in that city, in a moment of suspended animation of its slow life of steel and concrete. More than that, his preliminary explorations had centered themselves more and more closely about the Periisi, the inhabitants who were the most important of the city, yet who lived outside the city, in room and relative isolation. The 482nd was one of the many centuries in which wealth was unevenly distributed. The sociologists had an equation for the phenomenon, which Harlan had seen in print, but which he understood only vaguely. It worked itself out for any given century to 3 relationships, and for the 482nd, those relationships stood near the limits of what could be permitted. Sociologists shook their heads over it, and Harlan had heard one say at one time that any further deterioration with new reality changes would require the closest observation. Yet there was this to be said for unfavorable relationships in the wealth distribution equation. It meant the existence of a leisure class, and the development of an attractive way of life which, at its best, encouraged culture and grace. As long as the other end of the scale was not too badly off, as long as the leisure classes did not entirely forget their responsibilities while enjoying their privileges, as long as their culture took no obviously unhealthy turn, there was always the tendency in eternity to forgive the departure from the ideal wealth distribution pattern and to search for other, less attractive maladjustments. Against his will, Harlan began to understand this. Ordinarily, his overnight stays in time involved hotels in the poorer sections, where a man might easily stay anonymous, where strangers were ignored, where one presence more or less was nothing, and therefore did not cause the fabric of reality to do more than tremble. When even that was unsafe, where there was a good chance that the trembling might pass the critical point and bring down a significant part of the card house of reality, it was not unusual to have to sleep under a particular hedge in the countryside. And it was usual to survey various hedges to see which would be least disturbed by farmers, tramps, even stray dogs during the night. But now Harlan, at the other end of the scale, slept in a bed with a surface of field-permeated matter, a peculiar welding of matter and energy that entered only the highest economic levels of this society. Throughout time, it was less common than pure matter, but more common than pure energy. In any case, it molded itself to his body as he lay down, firm when he lay still, yielding when he moved or turned. Reluctantly, he confessed the attraction of such things, and he accepted the wisdom which caused each section of eternity to live on the median scale of its century rather than at its most comfortable level. In that way, it could maintain contact with the problems and feel of the century without succumbing to too close an identification with a sociological extreme. It is easy, thought Harlan, that first evening, to live with aristocrats. And just before he fell asleep, he thought of Noyes. He dreamed he was on the All-Wen Council, fingers clasped austerely before him. He was looking down on a very small Finge, listening in terror to the sentence that was casting him out of eternity to perpetual observation of one of the unknown centuries of the far, far Upwen. The somber words of exile were coming from Harlan's own mouth, and immediately to his right sat Noyes Lambent. He hadn't noticed her at first, but his eyes kept sliding to his right, and his words faltered. Did no one else see her? The rest of the members of the council looked steadily forward, except for Twistle. He turned to smile at Harlan, looking through the girl as though she weren't there. Harlan wanted to order her away, but words were no longer coming out of his mouth. He tried to beat at the girl, but his arm moved sluggishly, and she did not move. Her flesh was cold. Finge was laughing, louder, louder. And it was Noyes Lambent laughing. Harlan opened his eyes to bright sunlight and stared at the girl in horror for a moment before he remembered where she was and where he was. She said, "You were moaning and beating the pillow. Were you having a bad dream?" Harlan did not answer. She said, "Your bath is ready. So are your clothes. I've arranged to have you join the gathering tonight. It felt queer to step back into my ordinary life after being in eternity so long." Harlan felt acutely disturbed at her easy flow of words. He said, You didn't tell them who I was, I hope. Of course not. Of course not. Finge would have taken care of that little matter by having her lightly psychoed under narcosis, if he felt that necessary. He might not have thought it necessary, however. After all, he had given her close observation. The thought annoyed him. He said, "I'd prefer to be left to myself as much as possible." She looked at him uncertainly a moment or two and left. Harlan went through the morning ritual of washing and dressing glumly. He had no great hopes of an exciting evening. He would have to say as little as possible, do as little as possible, be a part of the wall as much as possible. His true function was that of a pair of ears and pair of eyes. Connecting those senses with the final report was his mind, which, ideally, had no other function. Ordinarily, it did not disturb him that, as an observer, he did not know what he was looking for. An observer, he had been taught as a cub, must not have preconceived notions as to what data is desired or what conclusions are expected. The knowledge, it was said, would automatically distort his view, however conscientious he tried to be. But under the circumstances, ignorance was irritating. Harlan suspected strongly that there was nothing to look for, that he was playing Finge's game in some way. Between that and Noyes, he stared savagely at the image of himself cast in three-dimensional accuracy 2 feet in front of him by the reflector. The clinging garments of the 482nd, seamless and bright in coloring, made him, he thought, look ridiculous. Noyes Lambent came running to him just after he had finished a solitary breakfast brought to him by a meccano. She said breathlessly, "It's June, Technician Harlan." He said harshly, "Do not use that title here. What if it is June?" "But it was February when I joined." She paused doubtfully. "That place, and that was only a month ago." Harlan frowned. "What year is it now?" "Oh, it's the right year." "Are you sure?" "I'm quite positive. Has there been a mistake?" She had a disturbing habit of standing quite close to him as they talked, and her slight lisp, a trait of the century rather than of herself personally, gave her the sound of a young and rather helpless child. Harlan was not fooled by that. He drew away. "No mistake. You've been put here because it's more suitable. Actually, in time, you have been here all along." "But how could I?" She looked more frightened still. "I don't remember anything about it. Are there two me's?" Harlan was far more irritated than the cause warranted. How could he explain to her the existence of micro-changes induced by every interference with time which could alter individual lives without appreciable effect on the century as a whole? Even Eternals sometimes forgot the difference between micro-changes, small c, and changes, large C, which significantly altered reality. He said, "Eternity knows what it's doing. Don't ask questions." He said it proudly, as though he himself were a senior computer, and had personally decided that June was the proper moment in time, and that the micro-change induced by skipping 3 months could not develop into a change. She said, "But then I've lost 3 months of my life." He sighed. "Your movements through time have nothing to do with your physiological age." "Well, have I or haven't I?" "Have or haven't what?" "Lost 3 months." "By time, woman, I'm telling you as plainly as I can, you haven't lost any time out of your life. You can't lose any." She stepped backward at his shout, and then suddenly giggled. She said, "You have the funniest accent, especially when you get angry." He frowned at her retreating back. What accent? He spoke 50 millennial as well as anyone in the section, better probably. Stupid girl. He found himself back at the reflector, staring at his image, which stared back at him, vertical furrows deep between its eyes. He smoothed them out, and thought, "I'm not handsome. My eyes are too small and my ears stick out and my chin is too big." He had never particularly thought about the matter before, but now it occurred to him, quite suddenly, that it would be pleasant to be handsome. Late at night, Harlan added his notes to the conversations he had gathered, while it was all fresh in his mind. As always in such cases, he made use of a molecular recorder of 55th century manufacture. In shape, it was a featureless thin cylinder, about 4 inches long by half an inch in diameter. It was colored a deep but non-committal brown. It could be easily held in cuff, pocket, or lining, depending on the style of clothing, or, for that matter, suspended from belt, button, or wristband. However held, wherever kept, it had the capacity of recording some 20 million words on each of 3 molecular energy levels. With one end of the cylinder connected to a transliterator, resonating efficiently with Harlan's earpiece, and the other end connected field-wise to the small mic at his lips, Harlan could listen and speak simultaneously. Every sound made during the hours of The Gathering repeated itself now in his ear, and as he listened, he spoke words that recorded themselves on a second level, coordinate with, but different from, the primary level on which The Gathering had been recorded. On this second level, he described his own impressions, he ascribed significance, pointed out correlations. Eventually, when he made use of the molecular recorder to write a report, he would have not simply a sound-for-sound recording, but an annotated reconstruction. Noyes Lambent entered. She did not signal her entrance in any way. Annoyed, Harlan removed lip-piece and earpiece, clipped them to the molecular recorder, placed the whole into its kit, and clasped that shut. "Why do you act so angry with me?" asked Noyes. Her arms and shoulders were bare, and her long legs shimmered in faintly luminescent foamite. He said, "I am not angry. I have no feeling for you at all." At the moment, he felt the statement to be rigidly true. She said, "Are you still working? Surely you must be tired." "I can't work if you are here," he replied peevishly. "You are angry with me. You did not say a word to me all evening." "I said as little as I could to anybody. I wasn't there to speak." He waited for her to leave. But she said, "I brought you another drink. You seemed to enjoy one at the gathering, and one isn't enough, especially if you're going to be working." He noticed the small Meccano behind her, gliding in on a smooth force field. He had eaten sparingly that evening, picking lightly at dishes concerning which he had reported in full in past observations, but which, except for fact-searching nibbles, he had thus far refrained from eating. Against his will, he had liked them. Against his will, he had enjoyed the foaming, light-green, peppermint-flavored drink, not quite alcoholic, something else, rather, that was currently fashionable. It had not existed in the century 2 physio-years earlier, prior to the latest reality change. He took the second drink from the Meccano with an austere nod of thanks to Noyes. Now why had a reality change which had had virtually no physical effect on the century brought a new drink into existence? Well, he wasn't a computer, so there was no use asking himself that question. Besides, even the most detailed possible computations could never eliminate all uncertainty, all random effects. If that weren't so, there would be no need for observers. They were alone together in the house, Noyes and himself. Meccanos were at the height of their popularity these 2 decades past, and would remain so for nearly a decade more in this reality, so there were no human servants about. Of course, with the female of the species as economically independent as the male, and able to attain motherhood if she so wished, without the necessities of physical childbearing, there could be nothing improper in their being together alone, in the eyes of the 482nd at least. Yet Harlan felt compromised. The girl was stretched out on her elbow on a sofa opposite. Its patterned covering sank beneath her as though avid to embrace her. She had kicked off the transparent shoes she had been wearing, and her toes curled and uncurled within the flexible foamite, like the soft paws of a luxuriant cat. She shook her head, and whatever it was that had kept her hair arranged upward, away from her ears, in intricate intertwinings, was suddenly loosened. The hair tumbled about her neck, and her bare shoulders became more creamily lovely at the contrast with the black hair. She murmured, "How old are you?" That he certainly should not have answered. It was a personal question, and the answer was none of her business. What he should have said at that point, with polite firmness, was, "May I be left to my work?" Instead, what he heard himself saying was, 32 years. He meant physio years, of course. She said, "I'm younger than you. I'm 27, but I suppose I won't always look younger than you. I suppose you'll be like this, when I'm an old woman. What made you decide to be 32? Can you change if you wish? Wouldn't you want to be younger? What are you talking about? Harlan rubbed his forehead to clear his mind. She said softly, You live forever. You're an eternal. Was it a question or a statement? He said, You're mad. We grow old and die like anyone else. She said, You can tell me. Her voice was low and cajoling. The 50 millennial language, which he had always thought harsh and unpleasant, seemed euphonious after all. Or was it merely that a full stomach and the scented air had dulled his ears? She said, You can see all times, visit all places. I so wanted to work in eternity. I waited the longest time for them to let me. I thought maybe they'd make me an eternal, and then I found there were only men there. Some of them wouldn't even talk to me because I was a woman. You wouldn't talk to me. We're all busy, mumbled Harlan, fighting to keep off something that could only be described as a numb content. I was very busy. But why aren't there more women Eternals? Harlan couldn't trust himself to speak. What could he say? That members of eternity were chosen with infinite care, since 2 conditions had to be met. First, they must be equipped for the job. Second, their withdrawal from time must have no deleterious effect upon reality. Reality. That was the word he must not mention under any circumstances. He felt the spinning sensation in his head grow stronger, and he closed his eyes for a moment to stop it. How many excellent prospects had been left untouched in time, because their removal into eternity would have meant the non-birth of children, the non-death of women and men, non-marriage, non-happenings, non-circumstance that would have twisted reality in directions the All-When Council could not permit. Could he tell her any of this? Of course not. Could he tell her that women almost never qualified for eternity because, for some reason he did not understand, computers might, but he himself certainly did not, their abstraction from time was from 10 to 100 times as likely to distort reality as was the abstraction of a man? All the thoughts, jumbled together in his head, lost and whirling, joined to one another in a free association that produced odd, almost grotesque, but not entirely unpleasant results. Noyes was closer to him now, smiling. He heard her voice like a drifting wind. "Oh, you Eternals, you are so secretive. You won't share at all. Make me an Eternal." Her voice was a sound now that didn't coalesce into separate words, just a delicately modulated sound that insinuated itself into his mind. He longed to tell her, "There's no fun in eternity, lady, we work. We work to plot out all the details of every when from the beginning of eternity to where Earth is empty, and we try to plot out all the infinite possibilities of all the might-have-beens and pick out a might-have-been that is better than what is and decide where in time we can make a tiny little change to twist the is to the might-be, and we have a new is and look for a new might-be, forever and forever. And that is how it has been since Vicar Melanson discovered the temporal field in the 24th, way back in the primitive 24th. And then it was possible to start eternity in the 27th. The mysterious Melanson, whom no man knows and who started eternity, really, and the new might be, forever and forever and forever and... He shook his head, but the whirligig of thought went on, in stranger and more jagged breaks and leaps, until it jumped into a sudden flash of illumination that persisted for a brilliant second, then died. That moment steadied him. He grasped for it, but it was gone. The peppermint drink? Noyes was still closer, her face not quite clear in his gaze. He could feel her hair against his cheek, the warm, light pressure of her breath. He ought to draw away, but strangely, he found he did not want to. "If I were made an Eternal," she breathed, almost in his ear, though the words were scarcely heard above the beating of his heart. Her lips were moist and parted. "Wouldn't you like to?" He did not know what she meant, but suddenly he didn't care. He seemed in flames. He put out his arms clumsily, gropingly. She did not resist, but melted and coalesced with him. It all happened dreamily, as though it were happening to someone else. It wasn't nearly as repulsive as he had always imagined it must be. It came as a shock to him, a revelation that it wasn't repulsive at all. Even afterward, when she leaned against him with her eyes all soft and smiling a little, he found he had to reach out and stroke her damp hair with slow and trembling delight. She was entirely different in his eyes now. She was not a woman, not an individual at all. She was suddenly an aspect of himself. She was, in a strange and unexpected way, a part of himself. The spatio-temporal chart said nothing of this, yet Harlan felt no guilt. It was only the thought of Finge that aroused strong emotion in Harlan's breast, and that wasn't guilt. Not at all. It was satisfaction, even triumph. In bed, Harlan could not sleep. The light-headedness had worn off now, but there was still the unusual fact that for the first time in his adult life, a grown woman shared his bed. He could hear her soft breathing, and in the ultra-dim glow to which the internal light of the walls and ceiling had been reduced, he could see her body as the merest shadow next to his. He had only to move his hand to feel the warmth and softness of her flesh, and he dared not do that, lest he wake her out of whatever dreaming she might have. It was as though she were dreaming for the two of them, dreaming herself and himself and all that had happened, and as though her waking would drive it all from existence. It was a thought that seemed a piece of those other queer, unusual thoughts he had experienced just before. Those had been strange thoughts, coming to him at a moment between sense and nonsense. He tried to recapture them and could not. Yet suddenly it was very important that he recapture them, for although he could not remember the details, he could remember that, for just an instant, he had understood something. He was not certain what that something was, but there had been the unearthly clarity of the half-asleep, when more than mortal eye and mind seems suddenly to come to life. His anxiety grew. Why couldn't he remember? So much had been in his grasp. For the moment, even the sleeping girl beside him receded into the hinterland of his thoughts. He thought, if I follow the thread, I was thinking of reality and eternity. Yes, and Melanson, and the cub. He stopped there. Why the cub? Why Cooper? He hadn't thought of him. But if he hadn't, then why should he think of Brinsley Sheridan Cooper now? He frowned. What was the truth that connected all this? What was it he was trying to find? What made him so sure there was something to find? Harlan felt chilled, for with these questions a distant glow of that earlier illumination seemed to break upon the horizons of his mind, and he almost knew. He held his breath, did not press for it. Let it come. Let it come. And in the quiet of that night, a night already so uniquely significant in his life, an explanation and interpretation of events came to him that at any saner, more normal time he would not have entertained for a moment. He let the thought bud and flower, let it grow until he could see it explain 100 odd points that otherwise simply remained odd. He would have to investigate this, check this, back in eternity. But in his heart he was already convinced that he knew a terrible secret he was not meant to know. A secret that embraced all eternity. Chapter 6. Life Plotter. A month of physio-time had passed since that night in the 482nd, when he grew acquainted with many things. Now, if one calculated by ordinary time, he was nearly 2,000 centuries in Noyes Lambent's future, attempting by a mixture of bribery and cajolery to learn what lay in store for her in a new reality. It was worse than unethical, but he was past caring. In the physio month just gone, he had, in his own eyes, become a criminal. There was no way of glossing over that fact. He would be no more a criminal by compounding his crime, and he had a great deal to gain by doing so. Now, as part of his felonious maneuvering, he made no effort to choose a milder phrase. He stood at the barrier before the 2456th. Entry into time was much more complicated than mere passage between eternity and the kettle shafts.
In order to enter time, the coordinates fixing the desired region on Earth's surface had painstakingly to be adjusted, and the desired moment of time pinpointed within the century. Yet, despite inner tension, Harlan handled the controls with the ease and quick confidence of a man with much experience and a great talent. Harlan found himself in the engine room he had seen first on the viewing screen within eternity. At this physio moment, sociologist Voy would be sitting safely before that screen watching for the technician's touch that was to come. Harlan felt no hurry. The room would remain empty for the next 156 minutes. To be sure, the spatio-temporal chart allowed him only 110 minutes, leaving the remaining 46 as the customary 40% margin. Margin was there in case of necessity, but a technician was not expected to have to use it. A margin eater did not remain a specialist long. Harlan, however, expected to use no more than 2 minutes of the 110. Wearing his wrist-borne field generator so that he was surrounded by an aura of physio-time, an effluvium, so to speak, of eternity, and therefore protected from any of the effects of reality change, he took one step toward the wall, lifted a small container from its position on a shelf, and placed it in a carefully adjusted spot on the shelf below. Having done that, he re-entered eternity in a way that seemed as prosaic to himself as passage through any door might be. Had there been a timer watching, it would have seemed to him that Harlan had simply disappeared. The small container stayed where he put it. It played no immediate role in world history. A man's hand, hours later, reached for it, but did not find it. A search revealed it half an hour later still, but in the interim, a force field had blanked out, and a man's temper had been lost. A decision which would have remained unmade in the previous reality was now made in anger. A meeting did not take place. A man who would have died lived a year longer, under other circumstances. Another who would have lived died somewhat sooner. The ripples spread wider, reaching their maximum in the 2481st, which was 25 centuries upwen from the touch. The intensity of the reality change declined thereafter. Theorists pointed out that nowhere to the infinite upwen from the touch the change had become too small to detect by the finest computing, and that was the practical limit. Of course, no human being in time could ever possibly be aware of any reality change having taken place. Mind changed as well as matter, and only Eternals could stand outside it all and see the change. Sociologist Voy was staring at the bluish scene in the 2481st, where earlier there had been all the activity of a busy spaceport. He barely looked up when Harlan entered. He barely mumbled something that might have been a greeting. A change had indeed blasted the spaceport. Its shininess was gone. What buildings there stood were not the grand creations they had been. A spaceship rusted. There were no people. There was no motion. Harlan allowed himself a small smile that flickered for a moment, then vanished. It was MDR all right. Maximum desired response. And it had happened at once. The change did not necessarily take place at the precise moment of the technician's touch. If the calculations that went into the touch were sloppy, hours or days might elapse before the change actually took place, counting, of course, by physio time. It was only when all degrees of freedom vanished that the change took place. While there was even a mathematical chance for alternate actions, the change did not take place. It was Harlan's pride that when he calculated an MNC, when it was his hand that contrived the touch, the degrees of freedom vanished at once, and the change took place instantly. Voy said softly, "It had been very beautiful." The phrase grated Harlan's ears, seeming to detract from the beauty of his own performance. "I wouldn't regret," he said, "having space travel bred out of reality altogether." "No?" said Voy. "What good is it? It never lasts more than a millennium or two. People get tired. They come back home and the colonies die out. Then after another 4 or 5 millennia, or 40 or 50, they try again and it fails again. It is a waste of human ingenuity and effort." Voy said dryly, "You're quite a philosopher." Harlan flushed. He thought, what's the use in talking to any of them? He said angrily, with a sharp change of subject,
What about the life plotter? What about him? Would you check with the man? He ought to have made some progress by now. The sociologist let a look of disapproval drift across his face, as though to say, "You're the impatient one, aren't you?" Aloud he said, "Come with me, and let's see." The nameplate on the office door said Niran Farouk, which struck Harlan's eye and mind because of its faint similarity to a pair of rulers in the Mediterranean era during primitive times. His weekly discourses with Cooper had sharpened his own preoccupation with the primitive almost feverishly. The man, however, resembled neither ruler, as Harlan recalled it. He was almost cadaverously lean, with skin stretched tightly over a high-bridged nose. His fingers were long, and his wrists knobby. As he caressed his small summiter, he looked like death, weighing a soul in the balance. Harlan found himself staring at the summiter hungrily. It was the heart and blood of life-plotting, the skin and bones, sinew, muscle, and all else. Feed into it the required data of a personal history and the equations of the reality change. Do that, and it would chuckle away in obscene merriment for any length of time, from a minute to a day, and then spit out the possible companion lives for the person involved, under the new reality, each neatly ticketed with a probability value. Sociologist Voy introduced Harlan. Farouk, having stared in open annoyance at the technician's insignia, nodded his head and let the matter go. Harlan said, "Is the young lady's life plot complete yet?" "It is not. I'll let you know when it is." He was one of those who carried contempt for the technician to the point of open rudeness. Voy said, "Take it easy, life plotter." Farouk had eyebrows which were light almost to invisibility. It heightened the resemblance of his face to a skull. His eyes rolled in what should have been empty sockets as he said, "Killed the spaceships?" Voy nodded. "Cut it down a century." Farouk's lips twisted softly and formed a word. Harlan folded his arms and stared at the life plotter, who looked away in eventual discomfiture. Harlan thought, he knows it's his guilt too. Farouk said to Voy, "Listen, as long as you're here, what in time am I going to do about the anti-cancer serum requests? We're not the only century with anti-cancer. Why do we get all the applications? All the other centuries are just as crowded, you know that. Then they've got to stop sending in applications altogether. How do we go about making them? Easy. Let the All-Wen Council stop receiving them. I have no pull with the All-Wen Council. You have pull with the old man." Harlan listened to the conversation dully, without real interest. At least it served to keep his mind on inconsequentials, and away from the chuckling summiter. The old man, he knew, would be the computer in charge of the section. "I've talked to the old man," said the sociologist, "and he's talked to the council." "Nuts. He's just sent through a routine tape strip. He has to fight for this. It's a matter of basic policy." "The All-Wen Council isn't in the mood these days to consider changes in basic policy. You know the rumors going round?" "Oh, sure. They're busy on a big deal. Whenever there's dodging to do, the word gets round that the council's busy on some big deal." If Harlan could have found the heart for it, he would have smiled at that point. Farouk brooded a few moments, and then burst out. "What most people don't understand is that anti-cancer serum isn't a matter of tree seedlings or field motors. I know that every sprig of spruce has to be watched for adverse effects on reality, but anti-cancer always involves a human life, and that's 100 times as complicated. Consider. Think how many people a year die of cancer in each century that doesn't have anti-cancer serums of one sort or another. You can imagine how many of the patients want to die. So the timer governments in every century are forever forwarding applications to eternity to please, pretty please, ship them 75,000 ampules of serum on behalf of the men critically stricken who are absolutely vital to the cultures. Enclosed see biographical data." Voy nodded rapidly. I know. But Farouk was not to be denied his bitterness. "So you read the biographical data, and it's every man a hero. Every man an insupportable loss to his world. So you work it through. You see what would happen to reality if each man lived, and for time's sake, if different combinations of men lived. In the last month I've done 572 cancer requests, 17, count them, 17 life plots came out to involve no undesirable reality changes. Mind you, there wasn't one case of a possible desirable reality change, but the council says neutral cases get the serum. Humanity, you know. So exactly 17 people in assorted centuries get cured this month. And what happens? Are the centuries happy? Not on your life. One man gets cured and a dozen, same country, same time, don't. Everyone says, why that one? Maybe the guys we didn't treat are better characters. Maybe they're rosy-cheeked philanthropists beloved by all, while the one man we cure kicks his aged mother all around the block whenever he can spare the time from beating his kids. They don't know about reality changes, and we can't tell them. We're just making trouble for ourselves, Voy, unless the All-Wen Council decides to screen all applications and approve only those which result in a desirable reality change, that's all. Either curing them does some good for humanity, or else it's out. Never mind this business of saying, well, it does no harm. The sociologist had been listening with a look of mild pain on his face, and now he said, if it were you with cancer. That's a stupid remark, Voy. Is that what we base decisions on? In that case, there'd never be a reality change. Some poor sucker always gets it in the neck, doesn't he? Suppose you were that sucker, hey? And another thing. Just remember that every time we make a reality change, it's harder to find a good next one. Every physio year, the chance that a random change is likely to be for the worse increases. That means the proportion of guys we can cure gets smaller anyway. It's always going to get smaller. Someday we'll be able to cure only one guy a physio year, even counting the neutral cases. Remember that. Harlan lost even the faintest interest. This was the type of griping that went with the business. The psychologists and sociologists, in their rare, introvertive studies of eternity, called it identification. Men identified themselves with the century with which they were associated professionally. Its battles, all too often, became their own battles. Eternity fought the devil of identification as best it could. No man could be assigned to any section within 2 centuries of his home Wen to make identification harder. Preference was given to centuries with cultures markedly different from that of their home Wen. Harlan thought of Finge and the 482nd. What was more, their assignments were shifted as often as their reactions grew suspect. Harlan wouldn't give a 50th century Groffen piece for Farouk's chances of retaining this assignment longer than another physio year at the outside. And still, men identified out of a silly yearning for a home in time. The time wish. Everyone knew about it. For some reason, this was particularly true in centuries with space travel. It was something that should be investigated, and would be, but for eternity's chronic reluctance to turn its eyes inward. A month earlier, Harlan might have despised Farouk as a blustering sentimentalist, a petulant oaf who eased the pain of watching the electrogravitics lose intensity in a new reality by railing against those of other centuries who wanted anti-cancer serum. He might have reported him. It would have been his duty to do so. The man's reactions obviously could no longer be trusted. He could not do so now. He even found sympathy for the man. His own crime was so much greater. How easy it was to slip back to thoughts of Noyes. Eventually, he had fallen asleep that night, and he awoke in daylight, with brightness shining through translucent walls all about, until it was as though he had awakened on a cloud in a misty morning sky. Noyes was laughing down at him.
Goodness, it was hard to wake you.
Harlan's first reflexive action was a scrabble for bedclothes that weren't there. Then memory arrived, and he stared at her hollowly, his face burning red. How should he feel about this? But then something else occurred to him, and he shot to a sitting position. It isn't past 1, is it? Father, time!
It's only 11. You've got breakfast waiting and lots of time.
Thanks, he mumbled.
The shower controls are all set, and your clothes are all ready.
What could he say? Thanks, he mumbled. He avoided her eyes during the meal. She sat opposite him, not eating, her chin buried in the palm of one hand, her dark hair combed thickly to one side, and her eyelashes preternaturally long. She followed every gesture he made, while he kept his eyes lowered and searched for the bitter shame he knew he ought to feel. She said, "Where will you be going at 1? "Aeroball game," he muttered. "I have the ticket." "That's the rubber game. And I missed the whole season because of just skipping the time, you know. Who'll win the game, Andrew?" He felt oddly weak at the sound of his first name. He shook his head curtly and tried to look austere. It used to have been so easy. "But surely you know. You've inspected this whole period, haven't you?" Properly speaking, he ought to maintain a flat and cold negative, but weakly, he explained. There was a lot of space and time to cover. I wouldn't know little precise things like game scores. "Oh, you just don't want to tell me." Harlan said nothing to that. He inserted the penne prong into the small, juicy fruit and lifted it, whole, to his lips. After a moment, Noyes said, "Did you see what happened in this neighborhood before you came?" "No details, Noyes." He forced her name past his lips. The girl said softly, "Didn't you see us? Didn't you know all along that—" Harlan stammered. No, I couldn't see myself. I'm not here till I come. I can't explain." He was doubly flustered. First, that she should speak of it. Second, that he had almost been trapped into saying reality, of all the words, the most forbidden in conversations with timers. She lifted her eyebrows and her eyes grew round and a little amazed. "Are you ashamed?" "What we did was not proper." "Why not?" And in the 482nd her question was perfectly innocent. "Aren't Eternals allowed to?" There was almost a joking cast to that question, as though she were asking if Eternals weren't allowed to eat. "Don't use the word," said Harlan. "As a matter of fact, we're not, in a way." "Well, then don't tell them. I won't." And she walked about the table and sat down on his lap, pushing the small table out of the way with a smooth and flowing motion of her hip. Momentarily he stiffened, lifted his hand in a gesture that might have been intended to hold her off. It didn't succeed. She bent and kissed him on his lips, and nothing seemed shameful any more. Nothing that involved Noyes and himself. He wasn't sure when first he began to do something that an observer, ethically, had no right to do. That is, he began to speculate on the nature of the problem involving the current reality and of the reality change that would be planned. It was not the loose morals of the century, not ectogenesis, not matriarchy that disturbed eternity. All of that was as it was in the previous reality, and the All-When Council had viewed it with equanimity then. Finch had said it was something very subtle. The change, then, would have to be very subtle, and it would have to involve the group he was observing. So much seemed obvious. It would involve the aristocracy, the well-to-do, the upper classes, the beneficiaries of the system. What bothered him was that it would most certainly involve Noyes. He got through the remaining 3 days called for in his chart in a gathering cloud that dampened even his joy of Noyes's company. She said to him, "What happened? For a while you seemed all different from the way you were in that place. You weren't stiff at all. Now you seem concerned. Is it because you have to go back?" Harlan said, "Partly." "Do you have to?" "I have to." "Well, who would care if you were late?" Harlan almost smiled at that. "They wouldn't like me to be late," he said, yet thought longingly just the same of the 2-day margin allowed for in his chart. She adjusted the controls of a musical instrument that played soft and complicated strains out of its own creative bowels by striking notes and chords in a random manner. The randomness weighted in favor of pleasant combinations by intricate mathematical formulae. The music could no more repeat itself than could snowflakes, and could no more fail of beauty. Through the hypnosis of sound, Harlan gazed at Noyes, and his thoughts wound tightly about her. What would she be in the new dispensation? A fishwife? A factory girl? The mother of 6? Fat? Ugly? Diseased? Whatever she was, she would not remember Harlan. He would have been no part of her life in a new reality, and whatever she would be then,
She would not be Noyes. He did not simply love a girl. Strangely, he used the word love in his own thoughts for the first time, and did not even pause long enough to stare at the strange thing and wonder at it. He loved a complex of factors: her choice of clothes, her walk, her manner of speech, her tricks of expression. A quarter-century of life and experience in a given reality had gone into the manufacture of all that. She had not been his Noyes in the previous reality of a physio year earlier. She would not be his Noyes in the next reality. The new Noyes might conceivably be better in some ways, but he knew one thing very definitely. He wanted this Noyes here, the one he saw at this moment, the one of this reality. If she had faults, he wanted those faults too. What could he do? Several things occurred to him, all illegal. One of them was to learn the nature of the change and find out definitely how it would affect Noyes. One could not, after all, be certain that... A dead silence wrenched Harlan out of his reverie. He was in the life plotter's office once more. Sociologist Voy was watching him out of the corner of his eye. Farouk's death's head was lowering at him. And the silence was piercing. It took a moment for the significance to penetrate. Just a moment. The summitor had ceased its inner clucking. Harlan jumped up. "You have the answer, life plotter." Farouk looked down at the flimsies in his hand. "Yeah, sure. Sort of funny. May I have it?" Harlan held out his hand. It was trembling visibly. "There's nothing to see. That's what's funny." "What do you mean, nothing?" Harlan stared at Farouk with eyes that suddenly smarted till there was only a tall, thin blur where Farouk stood. The life plotter's matter-of-fact voice sounded thin. "The dame doesn't exist in the new reality. No personality shift, she's just out, that's all, gone. I ran the alternatives down to probability 0.0001. She doesn't make it anywhere. In fact," and he reached up to rub his cheek with long, spare fingers, "with the combination of factors you handed me, I don't quite see how she fit in the old reality." Harlan hardly heard. But the change was such a small one." "I know. A funny combination of factors. Here, you want the flimsies?" Harlan's hand closed over them, unfeeling. Noyes gone? Noyes non-existent? How could that be? He felt a hand on his shoulder, and Voy's voice clashed on his ear. "Are you ill, technician?" The hand drew away as though it already regretted its careless contact with the technician's body. Harlan swallowed, and with an effort composed his features. "I'm quite well. Would you take me to the kettle?" He must not show his feelings. He must act as though this were what he represented it to be, a mere academic investigation. He must disguise the fact that with Noyes's non-existence in the new reality, he was almost physically overwhelmed by a flood of pure elation, unbearable joy.